Hello there, welcome to Ancient Earth Archives, where the mysteries of Earth's forgotten past come to life. Tonight we're heading somewhere older than memory, older than story, older than the word old had any meaning at all. Not into space, not into dreams, but backwards. Way backwards. Not just before your grandparents or pyramids or cave paintings, before humans, before mammals, before dinosaurs, before almost anything that had a spine. We're going to explore a version of Earth that existed before we ever did, and the lives that shaped it, ruled it, and then, like everything eventually does, vanished. It's the kind of journey that requires a soft blanket, a quiet mind, and maybe the gentle creak of time getting ready to roll in reverse. And if you're listening right now, wherever you are on this big old planet, maybe take a moment and look around. Your floor, your window, your hands, all of it is impossibly recent. Your house, the street outside, the very species you belong to, it's all new, not just in a modern sense, but in a geological one. You're a last-second development in a story that's been going on for billions of years. And the characters who came before, they weren't human. They weren't even close. So, tonight, let's take our time. Let's go slow. You don't need to know all the names or remember every detail. Just let the layers peel back. No rush. After all, this is Earth, and it has nothing but time. If you were to press rewind on the planet, not just years or centuries, but deep time, millions of years per second, the surface would change faster than your eyes could follow. Forests would vanish. Oceans would shrink and swell. Mountain ranges would crumble backward into dust and lift again into the sky. Cities would flicker out in the blink of an eye, replaced by ice, then tundra, then nothing. Animals would disappear like passing thoughts. Even the continents wouldn't sit still. They'd flow and twist like puzzle pieces dipped in syrup. And underneath all of that, under the noise, under the layers, something else would be happening. The further back you go, the stranger the life becomes. First it grows unfamiliar, then alien, then eventually almost invisible. Life as we know it took its time. And it didn't start with us, not even close. Our earliest ancestors weren't people or even animals. They were chemistry, molecules bumping into each other in shallow pools, trying things. Some stuck around, most didn't. The ones that did, well, they got better at staying. But before we get to the winners, the dinosaurs, the mammals, the brainy little branch that would one day lead to us, we need to ask a basic question. What even counts as life? When you go back this far, it's not so simple. We're used to thinking of living things as creatures, things that move, breathe, eat. But life didn't start that way. It started small, really small. Not just microscopic, but near invisible to even our best instruments. Early life didn't hunt or think. It reacted, it copied. Sometimes it failed. And sometimes that failure became a new way to live. The planet itself wasn't always kind to life. In fact, it was downright hostile for a long time. The early Earth was violent, unstable, and loud. It had fire in its lungs and acid in its rain. Asteroids visited frequently with less grace and more impact than anyone would have preferred. And yet, in some shadowy corner of a shallow ocean, something began. Not a fish, not even a cell, but a pattern. A way of arranging atoms that could make more of itself. The first replicating molecules. They weren't alive in the way we think of it now, but they were the start. Think of them like the first version of a story told without a storyteller. Just a sequence repeating purely because the physics allowed it. But even that was enough. Eventually, those chemical patterns learned to build walls, membranes, tiny bubbles that kept the inside different from the outside. These would become the earliest cells, and they'd change everything. The first real inhabitants of Earth weren't animals or plants, they were bacteria. More precisely, they were prokaryotes, single-celled organisms without a nucleus. They lived in the water, fed off the chemicals around them, and multiplied endlessly. They didn't build civilizations, they didn't walk or fly, but they were everywhere. And for over 1 billion years, they were the only things here. That's the part people often forget. For most of Earth's history, nothing had a face. No teeth, no eyes, no thoughts, just microbes. You could go millions of years in any direction and never bump into anything bigger than a speck. But that doesn't mean life was boring, quite the opposite. These tiny early inhabitants were hard at work, reshaping the entire planet. Some of them learned to eat light, not with eyes, but with chemistry. They developed a trick called photosynthesis, which let them turn sunlight into food. Sounds harmless enough, but in the process they produced oxygen as a waste product. That changed the game entirely. You see, oxygen is reactive, too reactive. It was at the time essentially a poison to most life on Earth. So, when these little light eaters started pumping it into the oceans and atmosphere, they kicked off one of the first mass extinctions in history. It's called the Great Oxidation Event, and it nearly wiped out life altogether. The planet rusted, literally. Oceans turned red from all the iron reacting with oxygen. Microbes that had never encountered oxygen began to die off in huge numbers. And yet, out of that disaster, something unexpected happened. A new kind of life emerged, cells that not only tolerated oxygen, but used it. These were the ancestors of all complex life, including us. That leap from simple cells to complex ones didn't happen overnight. In fact, it probably happened only once. Somewhere around 2 billion years ago, one cell swallowed another, and instead of digesting it, they formed a partnership. The engulfed cell became a mitochondrion, a tiny power plant that made energy more efficiently than anything that came before. This was the beginning of eukaryotes, cells with internal structures, including a nucleus. Every plant, animal, and fungus you've ever seen comes from that one strange moment of biological cooperation. One cell inside another, working together. Not war, not conquest, just unexpected teamwork. And once that kind of complexity existed, things started to get interesting. Multicellular life, organisms made of many cells, was the next major shift. At first, it wasn't glamorous, just colonies of similar cells stuck together. No nervous system, no shape to speak of. But over time, some cells specialized. Some focused on movement, others on feeding or reproduction. Eventually, that division of labor led to the first simple animals, but not yet the kind of animals we think of. These early creatures were soft, slow, and strange. Many left no fossils at all. Others, like the odd frond-shaped ED layers, and still confuse scientists today. They don't quite fit into the tree of life as we know it. Some had no mouth, no gut, and no symmetry. It's not clear how they lived or why they disappeared. Still, they paved the way. Then, around 541 million years ago, something dramatic happened. A burst of diversity and complexity unlike anything before. It's known as the Cambrian explosion. Not a literal explosion, but a rapid expansion of new body plans, new species, and new survival strategies. This is when many of the major animal groups first appeared. Arthropods, mollusks, worms with bristles, spiny swimmers with no modern relatives. Predation began in earnest. Eyes evolved. Hard shells and exoskeletons became common. The arms race was on. Trilobites, the ancient armored arthropods, scuttled along the seafloor. Anomalocaris, a creature with stalked eyes and grabbing appendages, became one of the first apex predators. Sponges filtered nutrients from water, while strange ribbon-like worms tunneled through the seafloor. None of these animals would survive to the present day, but their blueprints live on. Even at this early stage, ecosystems were forming. Food chains, niches, competition. It wasn't just random blobs floating through the sea anymore. It was strategy, defense, cooperation, and conflict. Evolution had found momentum, and there was no going back. But we're not there yet. Not even close. Because this explosion of life, as important as it was still confined to the ocean. For hundreds of millions of years after the Cambrian, land remained untouched by animals. A dry, lifeless crust. Not because it couldn't support life, but because nothing had figured out how to handle the dryness, the ultraviolet light, the absence of buoyancy. The sea was still safer, still easier. Eventually, though, something started to change, and the ones who changed first weren't animals at all. They were plants, or rather the ancestors of what would become plants. But we'll get there, because before roots gripped soil and before legs touched land, the ocean still had stories to tell. More than you'd expect. Before there was life, there was a planet. Not quiet, not calm, but alive in a different way. Volatile, boiling, reshaping itself from the inside out. If you were to visit Earth in its earliest days, you wouldn't recognize it. You wouldn't breathe. You wouldn't stand. You probably wouldn't survive even a few seconds. And yet, this was home, long before anything called it that. Let's go back. Not thousands of years or millions, but billions. Around 5 billion years ago, give or take a cosmic moment, the Earth formed from a cloud of dust and gas orbiting a newborn sun. Pieces of rock and metal crashed into each other in a violent construction project that lasted tens of millions of years. Collisions weren't rare, they were constant. Some of them were small, like pebbles joining a pile. Others were more like planetary car crashes. One of those collisions, perhaps the most important, involved a Mars-sized object slamming into the early Earth. The result? Debris, heat, and eventually the Moon. Yes, the very one that pulls the tides and lights up the night sky. It's a scar from the planet's earliest trauma, a lasting reminder that even calm has to be earned. After the chaos of formation, Earth wasn't a quiet rock cooling in space. It was a furnace. The surface was likely molten. Lava seas, volcanic eruptions, a sky thick with toxic gases. There were no continents, no oceans yet, just unstable crust forming and cracking again like a puzzle that refused to stay put. But slowly, over tens of millions of years, the crust cooled. Rain began to fall. Not gentle rain, but steam condensing into deluges that may have lasted centuries. These rains filled basins and hollows, slowly giving rise to the first oceans. The water likely came from both inside the Earth, released from minerals as the planet cooled, and from comet impacts, icy messengers carrying the building blocks of moisture across the solar system. The atmosphere in these early days was almost nothing like ours. There was no oxygen to breathe. Instead, it was a heavy, murky mix of carbon dioxide, nitrogen, ammonia, and methane. Ultraviolet radiation streamed through the thin veil above. Lightning split the sky regularly. To modern humans, it would be unlivable, but to chemistry, it was full of potential. This is what scientists sometimes call the prebiotic Earth, a world with no biology but a growing set of conditions that could give rise to it. Warm ponds, volcanic vents, mineral-rich coastlines, all of them churning with energy, minerals, and heat. And somewhere in that churning mess, something extraordinary began to stir. Not a creature, not a cell, but a pattern. The line between non-life and life is fuzzy, especially here near the start. Before anything could be alive, something had to start copying itself. Scientists have long wondered how that happened. How do you go from molecules just floating around, bumping into each other, to something with persistence, something that doesn't just fall apart? There are theories. One is the RNA world hypothesis. RNA is a molecule similar to DNA, but simpler. It can store information like a blueprint, and in some forms, it can even help speed up chemical reactions. In theory, some early RNA molecules may have formed by chance in Earth's watery soup, and some of them, purely by coincidence, might have been able to copy parts of themselves. If that sounds unlikely, well, it is. But when you have billions of molecules and millions of years to try, even very unlikely things start to look inevitable. Another idea focuses on hydrothermal vents. Those deep-sea geysers where hot mineral-rich water spews from the ocean floor. These vents create steep chemical gradients, lots of surfaces for reactions, and a constant supply of energy. It's a good setup for experimentation, and it may have offered the shelter needed for early chemistry to try something new. In both cases, the idea is the same. Chemistry under the right conditions can tiptoe into biology slowly, clumsily, but with results that add up. Over time, some of these molecular patterns became better at copying themselves. Some built protective shells, membranes, to keep their valuable parts safe. The first cells were born, simple, fragile, and alone, but no longer passive. They used energy. They grew. They reproduced. Life had begun. Quietly, invisibly, but without pause. If you could stand on Earth at that moment, and you'd need a suit thicker than anything we've made, you wouldn't see the change. There were no forests or fish or anything larger than a speck of dust. But in those early oceans, something extraordinary was unfolding. The rules had shifted. The planet had new players, and they were going to be around for a very, very long time. These early cells, the ancestors of all life, were single-celled prokaryotes. Most of them were bacteria. They didn't have nuclei or complex parts, but they were good at surviving. They ate chemicals from their surroundings. They floated, clustered, and drifted. They weren't alone for long. Variations emerged. Some bacteria developed different metabolic tricks. Some could digest new compounds. Some even found ways to harvest light. Photosynthesis, the ability to turn sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water into energy, didn't just feed those cells. It transformed the planet. You've probably heard that plants make oxygen. That's true. But the first organisms to do it weren't plants at all. They were cyanobacteria, tiny blue-green microbes that learned to turn sunlight into fuel. And in doing so, they began releasing oxygen as a waste product. At first, this oxygen reacted with iron in the oceans, forming rust that settled to the seafloor. But eventually, it began to build up in the atmosphere. That wasn't great news for a lot of early life. Oxygen, for all its benefits to us, is chemically aggressive. It damages cells that aren't prepared for it. So when oxygen levels began to rise, many life forms went extinct. Others adapted, found ways to avoid it, or learned to use it. This slow, uneven rise of oxygen, called the Great Oxidation Event, took place over hundreds of millions of years. It wasn't a single catastrophe, more like a long, difficult shift. Earth was changing and so was life. New ecological niches opened up. The biosphere grew more complex. During this time, continents began to take shape. Tectonic plates shifted and collided. Mountain ranges formed and eroded. Volcanoes erupted and rebuilt. The Earth's surface never stopped moving, and life, simple though it was, followed those changes. Fossil records from this period are sparse. After all, single-celled organisms don't leave behind bones, but some of them did build structures. Stromatolites, layered mounds made by microbial mats, offer one of the oldest visible signs of life. You can still find them today in places like Shark Bay in Australia. Slow-growing living fossils of a world that existed 3 billion years ago. These mounds form when colonies of microbes trap sediment layer by layer over centuries. They're not flashy, but they're persistent, and in the ancient world, they were common. Whole coastlines might have been lined with them. Calm waters, shallow seas, no fish, no footprints, just the quiet work of life reshaping its home, one microscopic effort at a time. Back then, Earth spun faster. A day was maybe 18 hours long. The moon was closer. Tides were stronger. Weather patterns were unfamiliar, driven by a different mix of gases. But still, amid all of that, life endured, grew, and waited. It would be easy to call this part of the story slow. Billions of years with no animals, no flowers, no drama we'd recognize. But that slowness was a kind of groundwork. The tools of biology were being sharpened. Energy systems, genetic coding, cellular structures, all the parts needed to make something bigger, stranger, and more mobile. Still, that was far off, because for now Earth remained a microbial world. And those microbes, they were doing just fine. They didn't need eyes or legs or even brains. They had time. And that more than anything is what early life had in abundance. Eventually, the next big leap would come. Cells would get more complicated. Some would join forces. Multicellularity would appear. But the path there wasn't straight. It never is. Evolution isn't about planning. It's about trying, failing, and occasionally stumbling into something that works better. And as that slow experimenting continued, the oceans remained the center of the story. Deep, dark, and full of possibility. Full of, if you could visit the Earth 3.5 billion years ago, you wouldn't hear anything. No birds, no insects, no wind through trees. The silence wouldn't just be a lack of sound. It would be the absence of things that make sound. No footsteps, no breathing, not even the rustle of leaves. There were no leaves. What you'd find instead is a planet in motion, but without an audience. Heat rising from volcanic vents, tides crashing into barren coastlines, the occasional meteor streaking across the sky. None of it witnessed, none of it named. But in the shallow waters along ancient shores, something had already begun. At first glance, these waters might seem empty, clear maybe, or cloudy with minerals. But under the surface, in the spaces between grains of sand clinging to rocks, drifting in columns of sunlight, were the first communities of life. Not animals, not plants, just cells, microbes smaller than dust living without sound or sight or even thought. But they were busy. These were the microbial pioneers, bacteria and archaea, single-celled organisms that built the foundation for everything that would come later. For a long stretch of Earth's history, they were the only inhabitants. For over 2 billion years, no other kind of life existed. And in that time, they didn't just survive, they transformed the planet. The earlier cells lived off the chemical energy around them. Some fed on hydrogen. Others consumed sulfur, iron, or methane. They thrived in places we'd now consider extreme. Hot springs, acidic pools, deep ocean vents. Even today, their descendants still live in similar environments. We call them extriophiles, but in the early world these weren't unusual niches. They were normal. Without competition from more complex organisms, microbial life could spread almost everywhere, and it did. Across the seafloor in the sediments of shallow lagoons inside porous rocks, it grew into mats, dense layered communities of different species living together. Some produced waste that others consumed. Some provided structure, others mobility. These weren't just accidental gatherings. They were the earliest examples of ecosystems, cooperative living at the cellular level. Over time, some microbes developed a new trick, photosynthesis. This wasn't the green plant version we know today, but a simpler method. Instead of using water and producing oxygen, these early photosynthesizers used hydrogen sulfide or other chemicals to capture light energy. The process was effective, and it gave them an edge in sunlit waters. They grew more quickly, spread more widely, and began to dominate certain environments. Then, somewhere around 2.5 billion years ago, another innovation appeared: oxygenic photosynthesis. This version used water as a source of electrons and released oxygen as a byproduct. The main players in this change were cyanobacteria, often called blue-green algae, though they're not algae at all. These small aquatic microbes didn't look like much, but they were responsible for one of the most significant shifts in Earth's history. As they multiplied, they began pumping oxygen into the oceans and the atmosphere. Slowly at first, the oxygen reacted with dissolved iron, creating rust that settled into thick layers on the seafloor. These banded iron formations still exist in ancient rocks today, a geochemical signature of microbial life at work. But the oxygen didn't stop with the oceans. Eventually it began to accumulate in the air, and that's when things got complicated. To most of the life that already existed, oxygen was toxic. It damaged proteins, disrupted cell membranes, and caused oxidative stress. As oxygen levels rose, many species died out. Others retreated to oxygen-free environments. Some adapted. For the first time, life faced an atmospheric challenge. Not a volcano or an asteroid, but the waste product of another living thing. This event, the Great Oxidation Event, wasn't fast. It took hundreds of millions of years, but it permanently altered the planet. The sky changed color, new minerals formed, climate systems shifted, and slowly the stage was set for something new. It's easy to overlook bacteria and archaea. They're invisible to the naked eye, often dismissed as simple, but calling them primitive misses the point. These organisms are masters of survival. They're flexible, inventive, and nearly impossible to eradicate. They've been found in deep Antarctic ice cores, boiling hot vents on the ocean floor, radioactive waste, and the upper layers of the atmosphere. Some can go dormant for centuries, others can metabolize metal. A few can even survive the vacuum of space. In the early Earth, these traits weren't quirks. They were standard features. Because the planet was still unstable, volcanoes erupted frequently. Meteors still struck from time to time. Oceans shifted, climate swung wildly, and through all of it, microbes adapted. Their ability to trade genes, form spores, switch metabolisms, that was evolution in motion. Long before anything had bones, Even without nervous systems, these organisms found ways to sense their environment. They could move toward nutrients and away from toxins using simple chemical gradients. Some developed internal structures, ribbons, scaffolds, primitive storage compartments. Others began to work in tighter groups, forming biofilms that offered protection and shared resources. It's in these groups that we see the first hints of collective behavior. Not consciousness, not strategy, but feedback. One microbe releases a signal, others respond. Together they change the local chemistry, sculpt the environment, and create tiny functional habitats. It's not intelligence, but it works. And it wasn't random. The shapes they built, mats, mounds, pillars, created new surfaces, trapped sediment, altered currents. In some cases, they even created shelter for future generations. Stromatolites, those layered rock structures mentioned earlier, were part of this legacy. They're not just fossilized bacteria, they're records of how bacteria modified the planet to suit themselves. These early life forms didn't just occupy Earth, they remodeled it. They turned it into a place that could eventually support complex life. Not by design, not through ambition, but simply by existing in large enough numbers for long enough with the right chemical tools. It's hard to say how many kinds of microbes existed back then. We only have partial records. Microfossils, tiny mineralized remains of single-celled life, can be found in ancient rocks. Chemical markers like certain isotopes of carbon or sulfur offer indirect clues, but the full diversity of early life is mostly lost. Its legacy isn't in what it looked like, but in what it made possible. Because eventually some of these microbes would begin to evolve new internal features, not just floating proteins, but membranes, compartments, and ultimately nuclei. The leap from prokaryote to eukaryote was enormous. It allowed for greater control, more complex chemistry, and larger cell size. But that leap was still far in the future. In this microbial world, evolution wasn't in a hurry, and it didn't need to be. Earth was vast. The oceans were deep. Energy flowed from sunlight, chemical gradients, and heat vents. Life had all the time it wanted. Still, the world was changing. Oxygen levels continued to rise, making the atmosphere more stable but also more demanding. Some microbes rose to the challenge, developing enzymes that neutralized oxygen's harmful effects. Others learned to use oxygen as part of their metabolism. This led to aerobic respiration, a far more efficient way of making energy. Organisms that mastered it had a new advantage. It's around this point that we begin to see the quiet outlines of complexity. Cells with more parts, more interactions, more possibilities, and eventually some of those possibilities would lead to cooperation, not just within a species, but between them. The first whispers of symbiosis began here. Not alliances or partnerships in the human sense, but one organism living inside another. In one extraordinary case, a bacterium entered a larger cell and stayed. It became the mitochondrion, the part of modern cells that produces energy. That event, a one-time evolutionary fluke, paved the way for all eukaryotic life. But before we get there, the microbial world still had more to offer. It wasn't just a stepping stone. It was the main story for most of Earth's history. Even today, microbes make up the majority of life on the planet by number and by weight. Your own body contains more bacterial cells than human ones. They're not guests. They're part of the system. Back then, they were the only system. No bones, no shells, no eyes. Just cells floating in water, dividing endlessly, reacting to changes in light, heat, and chemistry. It might not sound like much, but it was enough to change the surface of a planet. It was enough to build the base that every future species, including us, would depend on. And while the oceans remained their domain for eons, something else was beginning to stir in the background. The conditions for complexity were aligning. The oxygen was there, the energy was available, and the blueprints, messy, jumbled, unfinished, were slowly starting to take shape. Soon the ocean would begin to fill with things that could move. Not just drift, but swim, crawl, bite, hide. Bodies would get more complex, interactions would get faster, competition would increase. But before any of that happened, cells had to learn how to work together. For a long time, Earth was a planet ruled by simplicity. Microbes floated in oceans, clung to rocks, multiplied where they could. They consumed whatever was available, iron, sulfur, hydrogen, and made more of themselves with quiet efficiency. There were no predators, no speed, no structure to outrun or avoid, just chemistry, repetition, and time. Then a new molecule started to appear in the atmosphere. Not suddenly, not loudly, but steadily, one microbe at a time. Oxygen. Today, it's easy to think of oxygen as a good thing. We breathe it. We associate it with fresh air and clean water. It's life-sustaining, even comforting. But when it first began to build up in Earth's oceans and atmosphere, it was anything but welcome. For the organisms living at the time, oxygen was a threat, and not a subtle one. The earliest producers of oxygen weren't trying to be disruptive. They were simply doing what evolution had enabled them to do, harvesting energy from sunlight through photosynthesis. In the process, they took in carbon dioxide and water and released oxygen as waste. That waste didn't disappear. It accumulated. These organisms were cyanobacteria, and they were extremely successful. Shallow waters filled with colonies of them, forming thick microbial mats that blanketed the seafloor and coated coastal shelves. They built layer upon layer, capturing sediment and growing slowly toward the sun. From the outside it may have looked peaceful, but beneath the surface, the atmosphere was changing. At first, the oxygen they released didn't make it into the air. It reacted immediately with the iron dissolved in ocean water. The iron oxidized, essentially rusted, and settled out of the water as reddish sediment. This continued for millions of years. Entire layers of iron-rich rock called banded iron formations were laid down this way. They're still visible in the oldest parts of Earth's crust. Physical evidence of a planet adjusting to an unfamiliar chemical byproduct. But eventually, the available iron ran out. Once that buffering capacity was used up, oxygen had nowhere else to go but up into the oceans and from there into the sky. That shift, known as the Great Oxidation Event, happened roughly 2%, 4 billion years ago, and it caused a crisis. Organisms that had evolved in anoxic, oxygen-free conditions began to die. Oxygen, with its reactive nature, damaged the internal chemistry of cells. It broke bonds, disrupted molecules, and interfered with essential processes. For many forms of life, it was lethal. It's strange to think of oxygen as poison, but biologically, that's exactly what it was to early life. It produced what we now call oxidative stress, essentially molecular damage caused by unstable oxygen-containing compounds. These can tear apart proteins, disrupt DNA, and weaken cell membranes. For cells without defenses against it, the effect was devastating. The die-off wasn't fast. It played out over millions of years. Populations collapsed. Ecosystems collapsed with them. It wasn't a single mass extinction like the later, more famous events. It was more like a long suffocation. The chemistry of the planet was shifting, and the biosphere had to either adapt or retreat. Some microbes moved into deeper sediments or oxygen-free pockets in the ocean. Others adapted, slowly developing enzymes that could neutralize oxygen's harmful effects. And in time, some organisms figured out how to do something more remarkable: how to use oxygen. They didn't just survive it, they learned to burn it. That change, switching from anaerobic to aerobic respiration, wasn't cosmetic. It was revolutionary. Using oxygen to process food releases far more energy than previous methods. The cells that figured this out suddenly had more power, more flexibility, and more options. They could grow faster, move more actively, and build more complex structures. The stage was set for a new kind of life, but it came with trade-offs. Oxygen metabolism required more internal regulation. Cells had to invest in protective mechanisms. They developed antioxidant molecules, compartmentalized their internal chemistry, and tightened control over what entered and exited through their membranes. In a way, oxygen forced life to grow up. It also changed the planet itself. As oxygen accumulated in the atmosphere, it altered everything from weathering patterns to ocean chemistry. It oxidized surface rocks, affected the cycling of elements like nitrogen and sulfur, and began to filter the types of light that reached Earth's surface. New minerals formed. Some of them still wouldn't exist without oxygen in the environment. Perhaps most importantly, oxygen paved the way for the ozone layer. Ozone is a molecule made of 3 oxygen atoms. In the upper atmosphere, it forms a thin but critical barrier that blocks much of the sun's ultraviolet radiation. Before the ozone layer, Earth's surface was constantly bombarded with UV light. It was a harsh environment for anything trying to grow near the shoreline or in shallow pools, but with ozone in place, the surface became a little safer. That protection would matter later when organisms began to explore life on land. But at this stage, the ocean still held almost all the activity. They were the cradle and the testing ground, the place where oxygen forced life to change or disappear. We don't know exactly when the first oxygen-using organisms appeared. It likely didn't happen just once, but through many small steps across different lineages. Some cells took in parts of others, forming internal structures that could handle the new chemistry. These partnerships laid the groundwork for more complex cells, eukaryotes, that could manage their energy needs more efficiently. The presence of oxygen didn't just make complexity possible, it made it practical. Still, it wasn't a smooth path. Oxygen levels rose, then plateaued. For long periods, the atmosphere remained in a low oxygen state. Not enough to support large active animals, but enough to keep shaping the biochemistry of life. Some scientists refer to this as the boring billion, a stretch of time when life seemed to stall. But calling it boring isn't quite fair. During this period, the foundation of modern biochemistry was solidified. Cells were refining their internal machinery, experimenting with new shapes, new behaviors, and new symbiosis. The groundwork for multicellularity was being laid slowly, quietly, with oxygen acting as both fuel and filter. Eventually, the balance would tip again. Atmospheric oxygen would rise further. Ice ages would come and go, and life would respond in kind. Not with small, slow adjustments, but with a burst of innovation. Eyes, shells, limbs, jaws. But those innovations had a cost. The organisms that emerged in the wake of oxygen's rise didn't just live in a more dynamic environment. They had to compete, to chase, to flee. Complexity brought pressure, and pressure brought evolution. Before that happened, though, cells still had a few more tricks to learn. They had to learn to cooperate, to specialize, to build bodies with more than one type of cell. Skin, nerves, muscles, organs. That's where the story turns again. But it wouldn't have happened without the great poison. Oxygen, once a deadly mistake, became a catalyst for everything we consider alive today. Once oxygen found its place in the sky, the ocean didn't return to quiet. Life adjusted. Slowly but thoroughly, new ways of using energy emerged, new strategies for living in the changing chemistry. But long before the first creature with muscles or nerves ever existed, Earth had already seen construction. Not buildings, not roads, but biological architecture on a different scale. Communities built by microbes layered over time, hardening into stone. What they built weren't cities in any modern sense. No walls, no planning, no materials carted from one place to another. And yet these structures had shape. They had form. They were made deliberately through growth, by colonies of organisms that worked together, whether they knew it or not. These were microbial mats, sprawling sheets of life just a few millimeters thick, layered like pastry with different species performing different functions. Some fixed carbon, others handled nitrogen. A few focused on breaking down waste. Stacked in bands, these communities turned chemistry into structure. And over time, those structures started to interact with the environment in more permanent ways.
Sediment settled on the mats. The mats grew over the sediment.
More particles arrived and more layers formed. This pattern repeated layer by layer. It built up into domes and columns. These formations, when preserved, became what we now call stromatolites. They're not rare in the fossil record. You can find them in rocks over 3 billion years old. They show up in Australia, South Africa, Greenland, Canada, places where ancient rock has survived tectonic disruption. In cross-section, stromatolites look like ripples frozen in time, sometimes branching, sometimes folded. To a geologist, they're unmistakable. To a biologist, they're a kind of time capsule. These structures were built not by individuals, but by entire microbial ecosystems. Each mat was a complex interplay of bacteria and Archer sunlight, nutrients, and each other. They didn't communicate in any conscious way, but their chemistry was tuned to shared survival. One layer produced waste that the next layer used. Some microbes thrived in oxygen-rich zones near the surface. Others flourished in the anoxic depths just a few millim below. They created gradients, tiny shifts in pH, temperature, and chemical concentration that allowed dozens of species to coexist in a space thinner than a fingernail. That spatial organization, even without intention, formed the basis of resilience. When conditions changed, some layers would die off, others would expand, filling the gap. The structure remained. Modern stromatolites still exist in a few isolated places. Shark Bay in Western Australia is one of the best-known examples. The water there is unusually salty, which discourages snails and other grazers that would otherwise disturb the mats. As a result, the microbial communities are allowed to grow undisturbed, much as they did billions of years ago. They trap sediment, build up layers, and slowly accrete into stony mounds. Looking at them, you wouldn't guess they were alive. They resemble weathered rocks, pitted by time and tide, but inside they're busy. Just beneath the surface, microbes perform the same ancient chemistry. Photosynthesis, carbon fixation, sulfate reduction that powered their ancestors. It's not reenactment, it's continuity. Back in the Archean and Proterozoic eons, these microbial cities were widespread. Coastlines and shallow basins may have been covered with them. Without larger grazers or burrowing animals to break things up, they had room to grow. They shaped the seafloor. They influenced sediment flow. They trapped nutrients and built stable surfaces in a world that otherwise changed constantly. They also created oxygen. Cyanobacteria living in the top layers of these mats contributed to the slow, steady release of O2 into the environment. The same organisms responsible for the Great Oxidation event were also the main builders of Earth's first biological architecture. They didn't plan it and they didn't stop to look at their work, but they left marks that last to this day. These layered structures weren't the only result of microbial cooperation. In other environments such as hydrothermal vents, volcanic hot springs, and anoxic lake beds, different kinds of biofilms and microbial mats formed. Some produced slimes that glued particles together. Others precipitated minerals from the water, forming crusts, nodules, or branching formations. These mineralized remains are called microbial, a broader category that includes stromatolites, but also other patterns: encolites, thrombolites, dendrites, depending on how they grew and what materials were involved. To paleontologists and geobiologists, these structures are clues. They show how life left fingerprints in places where traditional fossils are rare or impossible to find. More importantly, they demonstrate something fundamental. Life doesn't just adapt to its environment, it alters it, sometimes subtly, sometimes profoundly. The first architects on Earth didn't carve or chisel. They secreted, layered, and built through metabolism. As these microbial structures became more common, they began to affect the chemistry of shallow marine environments. They changed the local pH. They influenced redox conditions, how easily electrons could move through the water, affecting everything from nutrient cycles to mineral solubility. In some places they created microenvironments where new kinds of reactions could occur. These weren't just side effects, they were feedback loops. Life was shaping its surroundings, and those surroundings were shaping life in return. A feedback system driven not by brains or choices, but by accumulation. It's difficult to say how diverse these microbial ecosystems were. DNA doesn't preserve well across billions of years, but by looking at modern analogies, communities in hot springs, salt flats, and deep sea vents, we can make educated guesses. The microbial mats of early Earth likely contained dozens, maybe hundreds of interacting species, some cooperating, some competing, all responding to shifts in light salinity and nutrient flow. They weren't static. Mats could shift location, rise or fall with sediment levels, expand into new areas. Some microbes formed spores to ride currents and colonize new territory. Others floated as plankton, forming blooms that could cover wide stretches of ocean surface. Even today, microbial life dominates the biosphere in terms of biomass and diversity. We tend to notice it only when it causes trouble: plagues, blooms, infections. But its role as a builder has never stopped. Soil formation, coral skeletons, mineral cycling in caves, even the microbial films that weather buildings. These are echoes of the same behaviors that started billions of years ago. Back then, those behaviors weren't background noise. They were the main story. It's easy to underestimate what can be built without intent. These microbial structures didn't come from planning or imagination. They emerged from repetition, trial and error, and simple rules playing out over time. But their impact was massive. They laid down carbonate platforms that would one day become limestone mountains. They created stable zones for new organisms to colonize. They influenced atmospheric chemistry. They laid a foundation, not just metaphorically, but literally, for what came next. Because eventually Earth's oceans would start to fill with larger things. Not all at once, not in a rush, but slowly and then with increasing variety. The first eukaryotic cells, more complex and internally organized, would emerge from the same environment shaped by microbial mats. And somewhere in those changing waters, cells would start sticking together, not just by accident, not just temporarily, but as a new strategy, a way of living as one unit instead of many. And from that idea, multicellularity, entire new possibilities would open. But the builders that came before didn't vanish. Their legacy runs through the stone under our feet. Their work shaped the seas that gave rise to everything that followed. Not bad for slime. For billions of years, life kept to a narrow script. Single cells ruled the oceans. Some floated freely. Others formed mats or built structures, but they all lived small. Simplicity wasn't just common. It was the only available option. Cells could specialize internally, evolve new enzymes, exchange bits of DNA, but most lived and died alone. Then something changed. It didn't happen in a single day or even a single million years. But compared to the vast stillness of what came before, the pace of biological change began to accelerate. Evolution found new tools, and life began to build in new directions. Structures got more intricate. Cells started working together in permanent ways, and eventually bodies appeared. Not just bigger blobs, bodies with fronts and backs, mouths and tails, eyes, limbs, armor. A few 100 million years earlier, none of that existed. Then, within a relatively short slice of geological time, the oceans filled with creatures that had never been seen before, and many that would never be seen again. It's called the Cambrian explosion. The name can be misleading. It wasn't an explosion in the explosive sense. There was no sudden burst, no worldwide detonation of species. What it really describes is a geological moment starting around 541 million years ago, when the diversity and complexity of life increased dramatically in the fossil record. Animals with hard parts began to appear. Movement became more coordinated, and for the first time, predation became a serious concern. Before this point, most life was soft-bodied, slow and focused on filtering nutrients or absorbing sunlight. There were few, if any, organisms that actively hunted others. There wasn't much need for defense because there wasn't much of a threat. But that balance tipped. Once some organisms developed ways to move purposefully, to sense their surroundings and to consume others, everything else had to respond. Shells appeared, spines, borrowing behavior, camouflage, eyes. These changes created a feedback loop. The better something got at detecting and eating its neighbors, the more pressure those neighbors felt to avoid, resist, or outrun the threat. Natural selection worked both ways, driving arms races in miniature. Trilobites are one of the best-known animals from this period. They were arthropods, relatives of modern insects and crustaceans with segmented bodies and hard exoskeletons. They crawled along the seafloor, some with complex compound eyes, some with elaborate spines. Fossils of trilobites are found all over the world, and they come in hundreds of shapes and sizes. Some were just a few centimeters long, others reached nearly a foot. They didn't dominate every ecosystem, but they're among the most durable fossils from the Cambrian. Other creatures were far stranger. An Amalcarus, for example, looked like something out of science fiction. It had a soft, flexible body that could undulate through the water, large compound eyes, and two grasping appendages at the front of its head. Its circular mouth, lined with overlapping plates, resembled a pineapple ring that had been sharpened. It was likely one of the first large predators, fast, efficient, and unfamiliar to anything that had come before. Hallucinia was smaller, but no less strange. It looked like a thin tubular worm with a row of spines on its back and tentacle-like legs underneath. For years, paleontologists weren't even sure which way was up. Fossils were interpreted upside down more than once. Its name reflects the confusion, a hallucination in stone. Opabinia had 5 eyes, 5 positioned on stalks spaced across its head. It also had a long, flexible proboscis, like a vacuum hose ending in a claw that it likely used to snatch up prey. Its body was segmented and paddle-shaped, perfect for swimming near the seafloor. There's nothing quite like it today, and there probably never will be again. Waxia, another Cambrian oddity, was covered in scales and spines. It resembled a flattened sea slug armored with leaf-like plates. It probably grazed on microbial mats, scraping up food with a simple radula, a tongue-like ribbon lined with tiny teeth. What all these creatures had in common was not just strangeness, but innovation. They represented experiments in form and function. Some succeeded and persisted into later eras, others vanished, evolutionary dead ends that left no descendants. Why this burst of complexity happened when it did is still debated. Some researchers point to rising oxygen levels which would have allowed for higher metabolic rates and larger body sizes. Others suggest ecological interactions, predation, competition, niche specialization drove rapid diversification. There may also have been genetic changes such as the evolution of regulatory genes that allowed for more flexible body plans. Whatever the cause, the effect was clear. In a world that had been dominated by microbial mats and simple multicellular blobs, animals arrived and quickly diversified into shapes and strategies we still see echoes of today. The Cambrian wasn't all swimming predators and armored grazers. Some creatures buried themselves in sediment to avoid being seen. Others evolved flattened bodies to move under the radar of visual hunters. Some began filtering particles from the water column, no longer relying on surface mats for food. Life was branching in all directions. The fossil record from this time gets richer, because many of these organisms developed hard parts, exoskeletons, shells, mineralized plates that preserved more easily in sediment. But even soft-bodied creatures left imprints in the right conditions. Sites like the Burgess Shale in Canada, Chang'an in China, and Sirius Pet in Greenland have revealed astonishing details. Muscles, digestive tracts, even the outlines of eyes. These fossils provide not just bones or shells, but a snapshot of entire ecosystems. Predator, prey, scavenger, filter feeder. The Cambrian oceans weren't just populated, they were layered and dynamic. There was no single strategy for survival. There were many, and each came with its own costs and benefits. Importantly, this wasn't the first appearance of multicellular life. Simple multicellular organisms had existed long before the Cambrian. What changed was the level of organization and interaction. Tissues formed, nervous systems began to coordinate movement. Eyes sent information to primitive brains. Muscles contracted in coordinated bursts. And with that, behavior became more important. No longer was life defined only by chemistry or shape. What an organism did, how it moved, how it responded, began to matter more. The foundation for animal behavior had been laid. That foundation wouldn't stop with the Cambrian. Later periods would refine and expand on what this explosion started. But for the first time, the world was no longer just inhabited. It was inhabited by creatures aware, at least dimly, of each other. They chased, they fled, They competed, and some thrived. From that point on, the oceans would never be simple again. There was still no life on land. That frontier remained untouched. But the seafloor, once a quiet carpet of bacteria and sediment, was now a battlefield, a garden, a marketplace, a crowded place where space and resources were limited, and evolution never slept. And in that growing complexity, another shift was brewing. One that would take some of these strange, soft animals and give them the power to support more weight, reach out, climb, burrow, and eventually one day to walk. But before that, there were reefs to build. By the time the oceans filled with crawling, swimming, and burrowing creatures, something subtle but powerful had already taken root. Something that would tilt the entire balance of survival. Among the bodies built during the Cambrian period, one feature kept showing up in new and slightly improved ways: the ability to sense light. At first it was simple. A patch of light-sensitive cells, able to distinguish brightness from darkness. It didn't create images, it didn't see shapes, but it could tell when something passed overhead or when the day shifted into night. For early animals that was already a big advantage. From there it got more complicated. Some of those light-sensitive cells deepened into pits. That allowed them to detect the direction of a light. Pits became cups. Cups turned into tubes. With time and many small changes, lenses appeared. Structures that focused incoming light more precisely onto sensory cells. With lenses came the first real eyes. And once that happened, everything else had to respond. Seeing changed the game. Before vision, much of survival depended on touch and chemistry. Organisms reacted to gradients, heat, salinity, acidity, or to direct contact. They relied on luck, on proximity, and on slow responses. Vision sped things up. It allowed creatures to sense threats or opportunities at a distance. You didn't have to bump into food or danger to know it was there. You could move toward it or away. Predators became better at finding prey. Prey became better at spotting predators. Suddenly, color and movement mattered. Shape mattered. Stillness became a tactic. So did speed. Arthropods, especially trilobites, were among the earliest animals to develop complex eyes. Some had compound eyes with dozens, even hundreds of tiny lenses arranged in a curved surface. Each lens captured a fragment of the visual field. Together, they created a mosaic view of the world, not sharp like a camera, but broad and very sensitive to movement. In a murky ocean full of floating debris and scattered light, that kind of vision was ideal. It allowed trilobites to detect changes in their environment quickly. If something moved nearby, they knew. If light dimmed suddenly, they could scurry into the sediment. The visual system didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to work better than nothing. Some early worms evolved eye spots, clusters of light-sensitive cells that helped them orient toward or away from light. Others developed simple lenses that improved focus, depth perception, and the ability to navigate more efficiently. Different groups tried different versions. Some stuck with compound eyes. Others evolved camera-style eyes with a single lens projecting an image onto a curved retina, an arrangement that would later be refined in vertebrates, including humans. But it wasn't just about seeing predators or prey. Eyes changed how animals interacted with each other. Visual cues became part of behavior. Mating displays, territorial recognition, warning colors, all of those would eventually emerge from the simple fact that eyes made such signals possible. In some lineages, vision became the dominant sense. It guided movement, foraging, communication. In others, it remained secondary, a backup to chemical or tactile signals. But even where eyes weren't central, their presence reshaped the environment. Consider how ecosystems functioned before vision. Many animals lived in or around microbial mats, feeding slowly without much mobility. Energy moved through the system in gradual flows. Sediment to bacteria, bacteria to grazers, grazers to filter feeders. Then, with the rise of sight, those flows accelerated. Active hunting began. Escape behaviors evolved. The structure of communities shifted from layered and static to dynamic and mobile. The predator-prey relationship changed fundamentally. Before vision, encounters were often random. With vision, they became directed. Strategy entered the picture. So did selection for traits like armor, speed, and mimicry. There's fossil evidence for this pressure. In Cambrian sediments, you start to see more shells, more exoskeletons, more burrows dug deeper into the seafloor. Animals were no longer content to sit on the surface. They began to hide to reinforce themselves to get out of sight. And that in turn drove innovation in hunting. Some predators grew longer limbs or better propulsion systems. Others developed more refined eyes. Anomaloris, for instance, had large stalked compound eyes with thousands of lenses. Its visual acuity may have been excellent for the time, helping it track prey in 3 dimensions as it swam through open water. Even filter feeders responded. They adapted their feeding structures to respond more quickly to changes in water flow or light conditions, retreating when shadows passed overhead. The presence of sight changed the rules not just for those who had it, but for everyone around them. Interestingly, the evolution of eyes also put pressure on sensory integration. How organisms combined visual input with movement and response. It wasn't enough to just detect something. The body had to react. That meant tighter coordination between sensory structures, nerves, and muscles. It nudged the development of central nervous systems, pattern recognition, and eventually simple brains. Those brains didn't think in any way we would recognize, but they processed signals, made choices, directed motion. That was new. All of this fed back into the broader story of complexity. A better eye made vision more useful. A more useful visual system encouraged faster movement. Faster movement required better control. Better control benefited from more processing. And more processing favored organisms that could handle more inputs, predict patterns, and act accordingly. The environment didn't create complexity, it rewarded it. And as visual systems evolved, they opened up new ecological roles. Some animals became ambush predators, using camouflage and stillness to strike at the right moment. Others became wide-ranging grazers, using sight to navigate large areas and track the position of the sun. Some began responding to lunar cycles or the timing of dawn and dusk. Even the shape of the ocean floor changed with eyes scanning from above. Being flat and visible was no longer safe. More animals dug down. Reefs offered protection, and burrows became essential. Soft-bodied animals developed spines, plates, or toxic chemicals, and sometimes they advertised those defenses with bright colors. Seeing and being seen became part of survival. Of course, light wasn't always available. Deep in the ocean, beyond the reach of sunlight, vision was less important. In those zones, chemical and mechanical senses stayed dominant. But in the fixed zone, where sunlight could reach, eyes took over, and they never gave it back. What began as a patch of pigment became one of evolution's most successful ideas. Eyes evolved independently multiple times across the tree of life. In arthropods, in mollusks, in vertebrates. Different designs, different strengths, but always serving the same function, to make distance matter, to let the world be perceived before it was touched. With sight came awareness. Not consciousness, not thought in the human sense, but spatial awareness. The ability to move toward a goal, to anticipate motion, to interpret shape and speed and direction. These weren't just traits, they were tools. And once life had tools, it began to change faster. The Cambrian wasn't the end of that shift. It was the beginning. Later periods would refine the visual systems, sharpen the responses, add layers of complexity. But the first step, the part where light became information, happened quietly underwater in creatures that would never know what they started. And with that new ability, the world got brighter. Not because the light had changed, but because something for the first time could see it. Long before forests reached for sunlight, or animals left trails in mud, the ocean was the only home life had. There wasn't a single open space, but a collection of habitats layered by depth, shaped by temperature, salinity, currents, and the seafloor itself. From shallow lagoons to deep trenches, the marine environment offered every kind of challenge and opportunity, and life responded with a range of adaptations we're still piecing together today. The Cambrian period had already shown what could happen when life figured out how to build bodies, but those bodies didn't float in isolation. They filled niches, formed networks, and began to shape ecosystems, interconnected systems where one organism's existence affected another's. These were the first real ecological webs, and they formed entirely underwater. In the shallow seas, sunlight filtered through just enough to fuel photosynthesis. This upper layer, known as the photic zone, was where most primary production took place. Microbes, especially cyanobacteria, still dominated in terms of numbers, but now eukaryotic algae had joined them. These more complex cells formed planktonic blooms, floating clouds of plant-like cells that drifted with the current, feeding on light and releasing oxygen in return. They were the base of the food web. Small animals like early filter feeders fed on plankton. Larger creatures fed on the filter feeders. The chain extended upward, linking species not by intent, but by energy flow. One of the major shifts in these marine ecosystems was the transition from microbial mats to more vertical structures. Reef building began. Not the coral reefs we know today, but simpler frameworks made by different organisms. In the Cambrian, certain sponge-like creatures and other calcifying animals started to bind together into reef-like formations. These early reefs weren't as expansive as later ones, but they added structure to the environment. That structure mattered. It provided surfaces for other creatures to cling to, hide behind, and feed from. It created protected microhabitats, crevices, tunnels, overhangs that allowed for more diversity. Life, it turned out, flourished not just in open water, but in the complex interplay of light, shadow, current, and shelter. On the seafloor, trilobites roamed in search of detritus or prey. Soft-bodied worms tunneled through sediment, aerating it, altering its chemistry. That activity, known as bioturbation, changed the composition of the seafloor, breaking up microbial mats and mixing layers. It wasn't just a side effect. It was ecosystem engineering. Small movements repeated millions of times transformed entire environments. These animals weren't working together in any conscious way, but their actions overlapped. The digging of one species affected the feeding of another. The shelter created by a sponge colony offered space for tiny filter feeders. Predators pushed prey species to develop defenses, shells, spines, speed that in turn opened new pathways for specialization. Evolution branched outward, shaped by the push and pull of environmental pressures. Open water ecosystems developed alongside benthic ones. In the midwater column, away from the bottom but not the surface, animals learned to swim, not just drift, but direct their movement. That ability opened new opportunities, migrating for food, escaping predators, mating across distances. It required muscle coordination, sensory input, and often streamlined body shapes. Some early swimmers developed body armor, cuticle-like plates to protect them in open water. Others went the opposite direction, reducing body weight to float more easily, relying on transparency or speed for defense. Planktonic animals, both herbivorous and carnivorous, filled this part of the ocean, forming a bridge between the photic zone above and the seafloor below. Deep-sea environments, though mostly beyond the reach of sunlight, weren't empty. Hydrothermal vents, where hot mineral-rich water erupted from the ocean floor, created their own ecosystems. These vents hosted chemosynthetic bacteria that used sulfur compounds as an energy source instead of sunlight. Around them, tube worms, clams, and other organisms evolved to survive in complete darkness, using heat and chemicals as their food supply. These vent communities may mirror some of the earliest life on Earth, and they still exist today, relatively unchanged. Across all these zones, reproduction strategies began to diverge. Some animals released clouds of eggs and sperm into the water, relying on chance for fertilization. Others developed more direct methods, internal fertilization, brooding, or even early versions of parental care. These choices influenced lifespan, energy use, and survival rates, and each method had implications for population growth and stability. Predation already underway in the Cambrian continued to shape these early ecosystems. Eyes improved, Jaws emerged, limbs adapted for grasping, slicing and pulling. Prey species responded with harder shells, faster movement, or by retreating into crevices. Ecosystems became more dynamic, less predictable. Food chains lengthened. Energy cycled faster. But not everything was fast-paced. Some organisms remained stationary. Filter feeders anchored to rocks, grazing slowly on particles in the water. Others burrowed deeply, safe from most predators. Still, others became tiny, reproducing quickly and swarming in huge numbers to overwhelm threats by sheer abundance. One of the more interesting patterns from this time is convergence. Unrelated animals evolving similar solutions to common problems. Streamlined shapes for swimming, compound eyes for detecting motion, hard exteriors for defense. These aren't accidents. They're responses to shared pressures in a shared environment. It was in these early oceans that body plans started to stabilize. Broad categories emerged. Arthropods with segmented limbs, mollusks with soft bodies and protective shells, worms with elongated forms suited to burrowing or slithering. These weren't finalized designs, but they were frameworks. Natural selection tested them, iterated on them, and in many cases kept them. The ecosystems of this period weren't simple. They were interconnected, reactive, and surprisingly resilient. Species went extinct. New ones evolved, but the overall balance held. Nutrients recycled through the food web. Detritus fed scavengers. Carcasses fell to the seafloor, feeding bottom dwellers. Nothing went to waste, and it was all underwater. Earth's surface remained bare. No plants, no insects, no vertebrates watching from the shore. The land was rock, sand, and weather, shaped by wind and rain, but untouched by biology. The action was in the sea, and for hundreds of millions of years it stayed that way. But change was coming, because while animals were building their kingdoms beneath the waves, something else had quietly begun to adapt to life above sea level. Not predators, not swimmers, but something slower, quieter, and rooted in place. The first land colonizers weren't hunters, they were photosynthesizers. For most of Earth's history, land was untouched. It existed as an empty stage, shaped by erosion, sculpted by wind and rain, baked by sunlight, frozen by seasons, but unmarked by life. No footprints, no burrows, no stems or roots, just rock, sand, minerals, and silence. The oceans, by contrast, were full. They had been home to every known form of life for billions of years. Every innovation cell's movement, vision, nervous systems had evolved underwater. The sea had energy, nutrients, and relative stability. The land had none of that. It was a harsher place, more exposed and unpredictable. But at some point, life stepped out. Not in a single moment. Not as a grand parade of animals crawling onto beaches. The transition from sea to land happened in small, scattered experiments. It began with organisms that didn't even move. The first to reach the land weren't animals. They were microbes, then algae, then fungi. Simple, often invisible organisms that clung to damp rock, forming biofilms and crusts. They fed off minerals, moisture, and sunlight. These pioneers helped weather the rock beneath them, breaking it down into finer particles. Over time, they created the thin beginnings of what would become soil. Next came plants, or rather their ancestors. Green algae, having adapted to photosynthesize in shallow sunlit water, eventually made the jump to land. It wasn't a simple transition. Water supports bodies, disperses gas, transports nutrients on land, and those problems had to be solved differently. Some algae adapted by forming tougher outer walls. Others grew low and spread wide, clinging close to damp surfaces. These early land plants had no roots, no flowers, and no true leaves. They were small and simple, probably similar to modern liverworts or mosses, but even in their simplicity they changed the game. They photosynthesized, they released oxygen, they shaded the ground and trapped moisture. Slowly, they began to shape the microclimate around them. Once land had a carpet of plant life, however thin, it became more inviting to other organisms. Fungi were among the first to form partnerships with these early plants, attaching to their cells and helping extract minerals from the soil. In return, the fungi received carbohydrates. This mutualism, a shared benefit, made both more successful. Even today, nearly all land plants rely on such fungal associations to survive. Animals came later. The first to venture onto land weren't predators or foragers. They were likely scavengers and grazers, organisms looking for microbial mats, decaying plant matter, or algae to feed on. Some of these early land animals may have been similar to modern springtails or mites, tiny soft-bodied aeropods that lived in the moist spaces between soil particles. They didn't wander far from water. Dry air was a constant threat. Without waterproof skin or efficient lungs, desiccation was a major risk. Most of these animals could only survive in humid environments, damp mud, mossy patches, the edges of freshwater pools. But within those narrow spaces, they found niches. The first real landwalkers were aeropods, descendants of marine ancestors. These creatures had exoskeletons that provided some protection against drying out. They also had jointed legs, allowing them to move across uneven terrain. Some may have resembled millipedes, long segmented bodies with dozens of legs trundling slowly through the leafless landscape. Fossils from around 428 million years ago suggest that these millip-like animals were among the first to establish themselves fully on land. They likely fed on decaying organic matter, breaking down dead plants and recycling nutrients back into the soil. In doing so, they helped build more complex terrestrial ecosystems. Other aeropods followed, early insects, spiders, and their relatives. Many remained small, staying close to moisture, avoiding the dry heat of open terrain. Flight hadn't evolved yet. These animals crawled, crept, or burrowed. Predators began to appear, small creatures that hunted other aeropods in leaf litter or under stones. The food web expanded. Back in the water, vertebrates were still watching from a distance. Fish had become more diverse, occupying rivers, estuaries, and coastal shallows. Some developed lungs, modified swim bladders that allowed them to gulp air when oxygen levels in water were low. Others evolved stronger fins, capable of pushing their bodies along the bottom. These adaptations weren't aimed at life on land. They were for survival in unstable water systems, seasonal ponds, drying streams, oxygen-poor swamps. But they had side effects. Fins that supported a body in shallow water could eventually support it inland. Lungs that supplemented gill breathing opened the door to full air breathing. Among these transitional fish were the Secopterygians, lobar-finned fish with robust bones in their fins. Over time, those bones would evolve into limbs. The skull would flatten, the neck would become more flexible, and the tail would shrink. Gills would give way to lungs, and one group would finally make the move onto land, not just for feeding or laying eggs, but for good. That moment when vertebrates stepped onto land permanently didn't happen in a single place or in a single species. It was a slow process of adaptation, tested by the demands of gravity, dehydration, and movement without the support of water. But it happened. By the end of the Devonian period, around 360 million years ago, the first true tetrapods, four-limbed vertebrates, had emerged. They still lived close to water, returning often to breed and stay hydrated. But their bodies were built for the new environment. Sturdier bones, better lungs, more sensitive ears, skin that resisted drying out. Land was no longer alien. It had been tested, colonized, and adapted to. These early ecosystems weren't like anything we see today. There were no flowering plants, no grass, no trees as we know them. Vegetation consisted mostly of ferns, club mosses, and horsetails, tall, spindly plants with simple vascular systems. Forests were sparse, and the air was probably thick with spores. Insects had appeared, but they didn't yet have wings. The sky remained empty, but the foundation had been laid. By this point, Earth's surface had gone from being entirely abiotic to biologically layered. Microbes crusted the soil. Mosses and ferns anchored into wet earth. Aeropods crawled beneath the canopy. Vertebrates waddled at the edges of lakes, and fungi worked quietly below it all, knitting the ground together. It's important to remember how recently this all happened in the context of Earth's history. For billions of years, land was untouched. Now in just a few 100 million years, it would host forests, mountains filled with birdsong, and eventually cities. But for now, it was a quiet place. The sounds were small, the movement was slow, but it was happening. The sea had been first, but land too had begun to wake up. By the time animals had begun crawling across damp ground and peering out from the edges of lakes, plants were already far ahead. They had crept over the land first, not in a rush but steadily, establishing the groundwork for what would eventually become entire ecosystems. But the landscapes they shaped early on didn't resemble the forest we know now. There were no birds overhead, no flowering trees, no buzzing insects. Even the word tree meant something different. The first forests weren't full of leaves, and they weren't green in the way we imagine today. They were made of plants that looked like they belonged to another planet, tall, spindly, segmented, and strange. Their branches didn't spread out with broad foliage, and they didn't drop colorful leaves in autumn, but they reached for the sky all the same. The earliest large plants to form forests appeared during the late Devonian period, starting around 380 million years ago. They belonged to a variety of groups, many of which have no modern descendants. Among them were the licorites, ancient relatives of today's club mosses, and the progymnosperms, distant precursors to seed-bearing trees. These early forest builders stood tall, some reaching up to 10 or 20 meters, but they didn't have true leaves or seeds. Instead, they relied on spores and simple vascular systems to survive. Take Archaeopteris, for example. It's often considered one of the first true trees, and it dominated many Devonian forests. It had woody trunks and a branching canopy, but it reproduced using spores, not seeds. Its leaves were more like flattened fronds than anything we'd see in a modern forest. Yet, it laid the blueprint for what a tree could be: tall, rooted, perennial, and structurally complex. Other plants like lepidodendron grew fast and straight with bark-like outer layers and a branching pattern that looked geometric and stiff. These belonged to the liquefied lineage and would later dominate entire swampy forests in the Carboniferous period. Despite their heightened bulk, they were closer in biology to small ground-hugging mosses than to modern oaks or pines. These forests weren't filled with color. There were no flowers because flowering plants wouldn't exist for another 200 million years. No fruit, no blossoms, no buzzing pollinators, just spores drifting through the air, released in clouds and left to chance. The air would have felt different too. Oxygen levels were rising, but the mix of gases wasn't the same as it is today. There were no grasses underfoot, no leaves to crunch. The floor was probably spongy with moss-like plants, decaying matter, and fungi. Roots were beginning to shape the soil, but the soil itself was still in development, thin, patchy, and easily eroded. In many places, exposed rock dominated. Despite their strange appearance, these forests transformed the planet. For one, they changed the climate through photosynthesis. They pulled carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and released oxygen. Over time, this led to a drop in global CO2 levels, which may have contributed to global cooling and even a major glaciation event near the end of the Devonian. The plants didn't intend to alter the planet's climate, but through their biology, absorbing carbon, building tissues, dying, and decomposing, they locked away carbon in a way the Earth hadn't seen before. Second, they changed the shape of the land itself. Their roots anchored soil, reducing erosion and helping trap sediment in place. Rivers began to change course more slowly. Valleys deepened more gradually. Soil became a longer-lasting feature rather than a temporary layer. When these early trees died, their remains often didn't decompose fully. In oxygen-poor swampy environments, fallen trunks and leaves built up in thick mats. Over millions of years, heat and pressure turned this plant material into coal. Much of the world's coal deposits trace back to forests like these, preserved not by accident, but by the unique conditions created by life itself. These early forests also created new habitats. For the first time, there was vertical space on land. Animals that had previously lived only on or under the ground could now climb, perch, or hide among branches. Insects began to specialize, not just in feeding on plants, but in living within them. Some evolved mouthparts for piercing stems or extracting sap. Others took to the air, eventually leading to the development of wings. The forest canopy also created shade. That in turn changed the light environment on the forest floor, favoring different plant communities below. Moisture was retained longer, and humidity increased. Layered complexity was emerging. Canopy, understory, soil, not in the lush, flower-filled way we imagine today, but in a rough draft form. The structure was there, even if the details were still in flux. Fungi played a major role too. Decomposers work through dead material, recycling nutrients and breaking down tough plant tissues. Some fungi formed close relationships with plant roots, mycorrhizal partnerships that helped both survive. These connections allowed plants to spread further and grow taller, and they still persist in modern forests, quietly linking trees beneath the surface. Yet, even in this growing complexity, things remained unstable. These ecosystems were young. The plants had no seeds, so reproduction relied heavily on water. Spores needed moisture to spread and germinate. As a result, forests were mostly limited to wetter regions near coastlines, rivers, and floodplains. Dry environments remained difficult for life. Without seeds or protective coverings, most plants couldn't handle desiccation. And without plants to hold the soil, arid areas remained barren. The expansion of forests was not even. It moved where the conditions allowed, pausing where it could go no further. Still, the momentum was there. Plants were adapting. Some began to develop more efficient vascular systems, better able to move water through tall stems. Others developed protective spores or started evolving the first seeds, encased embryos that could wait for the right conditions before sprouting. These changes wouldn't fully bloom until the next geological periods, but the groundwork was being laid. Forests without leaves, trees without flowers. The image doesn't quite line up with what we picture today. But these places were alive with quiet innovation. Every towering trunk was an evolutionary experiment in how to handle gravity, light, air, and time. Every root was carving into the earth, creating space for future organisms. Every fallen branch was feeding something somewhere, silently building a layer of habitability that would one day support animals as large as elephants and as clever as us. By the end of the Devonian, Earth looked different. Vast stretches of rock had been softened by plant growth. Waterways had been ruined by root systems. The air had changed. The soil had deepened. Carbon had been buried. And the stage, though still quiet, was almost ready for larger creatures to step forward and take their turn among the trees. But those creatures would not walk on two legs. Not yet. The next rulers of the land would crawl, creep, and breathe through skin, and some of them would grow very large. Once plants had filled the lowlands with tangled roots and vertical ambition, the animals began to follow slowly and at first cautiously. The forests had no flowers. The air held no bird song, but the land was no longer barren. The world was humid, shaded in places, and alive with spores and ferns. And within these green corridors, vertebrates were learning to move. But even as the land was beginning to change, the water still held the most dramatic stories. In the Carboniferous period, which began around 359 million years ago, a new set of conditions converged to produce one of the most unusual and impressive biological moments in Earth's history. The rise of giant animals, not in the oceans where they had once reigned, but in swamps, marshes, and forests. Many of these animals had gills, some had lungs, and others had both. They crept, swam, or glided through landscapes that were wet, warm, and oxygen-rich. And they were big, not just by early standards, but truly staggeringly big. This period didn't just host size, it enabled it. The reason wasn't a single factor. It was a combination of biology, climate, and chemistry. Most importantly, oxygen levels in the atmosphere were unusually high, far higher than today. Some estimates place atmospheric oxygen at around 30–35% compared to the 21% we breathe now. That surplus oxygen didn't just change the fire risk or the chemistry of decomposition, it changed the physiology of animals, especially those that relied on diffusion to breathe. Insects, for example, don't have lungs. They breathe through tiny openings called spiracles, which connect to a network of internal tubes that carry oxygen directly to their tissues. This system works well for small bodies but becomes less efficient as size increases. Under normal conditions, it imposes a natural limit, but in a high oxygen world, that limit was pushed much further. This is why dragonflies with wingspans of over 2 feet took to the air. Their name, Megura, means large-nerved, and they were indeed huge, gliding through swampy forests like small birds. Their close relatives filled similar roles, hovering above stagnant water, laying eggs on reeds, preying on smaller arthropods in the underbrush. With more oxygen, their muscles worked more efficiently. Their wings could support more weight, and they had room to grow. Millipedes also reached incredible sizes. One genus, Arthropleura, grew to lengths of 8 feet or more. It moved slowly like a living train of armored segments, feeding on decaying plant matter and navigating through dense leaf litter. Nothing alive today quite compares. Modern millipedes are tiny by contrast, curled and cautious. Their Carboniferous ancestors were more imposing, though likely harmless to anything larger than a bug. Amphibians, too, grew large. Unlike modern frogs or salamanders, these early tetrapods looked more like a cross between a crocodile and a newt. Thick-bodied, sprawling limbed, and often flattened, they used both lungs and skin to breathe. In the wet, steamy environment of Carboniferous forests, their porous skin worked well. Many spent part of their lives in water and part on land, laying eggs in ponds, hunting small prey in both realms. Some of these early amphibians reached several feet in length. Their skulls were broad and bony, their jaws filled with sharp peg-like teeth. They likely waited in the shallows, ambushing fish and invertebrates that wandered too close. Others were more mobile, moving through dense undergrowth in search of worms, insects, or smaller amphibians. Despite their size, these creatures were fragile in some ways. Their skin dried out easily. They were tied to moist environments, and their eggs lacked protective shells, meaning reproduction still depended on water. This kept them near swamps, rivers, and rain-heavy regions. The landscape itself helped. The Carboniferous world was dominated by vast land forests filled with liaits, ferns, and towering horsetails. Rivers meandered through floodplains. Swamps expanded and contracted with the seasons. There were no large mammals to disturb the undergrowth, no birds overhead, just the occasional sound of movement. Something crawling, something hissing, something flying low in the mist. Predation drove complexity. Some amphibians evolved stronger limbs and jaws, others flattened their skulls to slip under submerged logs. Many adopted camouflage, mottled skin, bark-like patterns. But predators weren't the only problem. Disease, drought, and competition were all constant pressures. In this lush environment, nothing stayed uncontested for long. Eventually, new players began to emerge. Among the amphibians, a few lineages began experimenting with internal fertilization, tougher skin, and stronger skeletons. These traits pointed in a new direction, toward independence from water, toward fully terrestrial life. The key to that transition was the amniotic egg, a self-contained capsule with membranes to protect and nourish the embryo. Unlike amphibian eggs, which had to remain moist, amniotic eggs could survive on land. This evolutionary innovation allowed the first true reptiles to appear. At first, they were small and unassuming, lizard-like creatures that laid leathery eggs in sheltered places and wandered through leaf litter in search of insects. But their physiology gave them freedom. They didn't need to stay close to water. They could range farther, climb higher, stay active longer. And with that flexibility came opportunity. Back in the water, fish were also growing larger and stranger. Some developed bony armor, others developed jaws powerful enough to crush shells. Cartilaginous fish, ancestors of modern sharks, diversified and spread into rivers and coastal zones. But the land was where the real ecological shift was happening. The swampy forests of the Carboniferous had created a stage where gilled giants could thrive for a while. But that stage was temporary. Toward the end of the period, the climate began to shift. Earth cooled, glaciers advanced, swamps dried, sea levels dropped, the vast coal forests began to shrink. As they vanished, so did many of the large amphibians and arthropods that had relied on humid conditions and constant vegetation. The age of giants with gills was ending, not with a crash but with a contraction. In its place, a new kind of animal was waiting, one that could walk, breathe dry air, lay eggs on land, and carry its world inside its body. The first true reptiles had arrived. They didn't look like much. Small, scaly, cautious, but they were less tied to water, and that made all the difference. They wouldn't rise to dominance overnight, not yet. But they had time. The forests had been their nursery. Now the rest of the land was theirs to explore. There have been 5 major extinction events in Earth's history, times when life took a sharp, unexpected turn, and much of what had evolved was swept away. The most famous is the one that ended the reign of the dinosaurs. But that wasn't the worst one. The worst came earlier, much earlier. It happened near the end of the Permian period, about 252 million years ago. By then, Earth's continents had already joined together into a single massive landmass, Pangaea. This supercontinent stretched from pole to pole, creating vast interior regions that were dry, wind-blown, and extreme. Oceans hugged the edges, but the center of Pangaea was a desert in many places, inhospitable and baking under seasonal heat. The world looked different, but life had found a way to thrive. Reptiles had begun to spread and diversify. Synapsids, mammal-like reptiles, had become dominant on land. Plants had continued to evolve, with seed-bearing gymnosperms starting to take over from the older spore-based flora. Insects were diverse. Amphibians still lingered in wetter areas, and the oceans were rich with corals, brachiopods, ammonoids, and fish. Then something happened, and almost everything died. We call it the Permian-Triassic extinction event, or more plainly, the Great Dying. It's estimated that around 90 to 96% of all marine species vanished. On land, about 70% of vertebrate species went extinct. Entire groups disappeared completely, leaving behind nothing but fossil records and gaps where their descendants might have been. This wasn't a slow background extinction. It was rapid, widespread, and devastating. The cause wasn't a single asteroid or one catastrophic event. Instead, it was a cascade of disasters, and at the center of it was something that began deep underground. In what is now Siberia, massive volcanic eruptions began to tear through the crust. These weren't isolated blasts like Mount Street, Helens, or Vesuvius. They were sustained outpourings of lava that lasted for hundreds of thousands of years. The result was a vast region known today as the Siberian Traps. Millions of square kilometers covered in thick layers of volcanic rock. These eruptions didn't just release lava. They released gases, carbon dioxide, methane, sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere at an enormous scale. CO2 levels spiked. The planet began to warm. Ocean temperatures rose. Rain became more acidic. The chemistry of the atmosphere shifted. In the oceans, that shift became deadly. Warmer waters hold less oxygen. As temperatures climbed, the seas began to lose their breath. Anoxic zones, areas with little or no oxygen, spread. Marine life that depended on oxygen-rich water suffocated. Coral reefs collapsed. Shelled creatures died off in massive numbers. Some species tried to migrate. Others simply disappeared. Methane released from thawing permafrost or disturbed seabeds may have added to the warming. Methane is a far more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. Once it entered the atmosphere, it accelerated the crisis. Meanwhile, on land, plants struggled with increased heat and changing rainfall patterns. Acid rain damaged forests. Wildfires became more frequent. Many plant species couldn't adapt fast enough, and without stable vegetation, herbivores lost their food sources. Carnivores followed soon after. The ecosystem didn't just bend, it broke. Insects typically resilient to extinction also suffered enormous losses. This is the only mass extinction in Earth's history where insect diversity dropped dramatically. Even the smallest, most adaptable forms of life were hit. The extinction didn't happen in a single year or even a single decade. It played out over tens of thousands of years. But in geological terms, it was abrupt. A blink. One layer of sediment shows a thriving world, the next silence. Fossil records from this time show a sharp decline in diversity, followed by a long empty stretch. Fewer species, smaller populations, simple ecosystems struggling to reassemble themselves. It took millions of years for life to recover to anything close to its former complexity. The Permian extinction marked a hard reset. Many of the dominant groups before the extinction, especially marine invertebrates and the larger snap-sided reptiles on land, were hit hardest. They left behind open ecological space, and over time other groups stepped in to fill the gaps. Among them were the Arosaurs, a branch of reptiles that would eventually give rise to crocodiles, pterosaurs, and dinosaurs. But in the immediate aftermath, life was subdued, the oceans were quiet, forests were sparse, food webs were short and fragile. Only a few generalist species survived, organisms that could live on little, tolerate heat, or endure erratic climate swings. The causes of the extinction continue to be studied. The Siberian traps remain central to the story, but some researchers suggest additional stresses may have played a role. Sea level changes, ocean acidification, the release of toxic metals from volcanic rocks, and disruptions to the carbon cycle. All of these would have layered stress on top of stress, pushing already vulnerable ecosystems over the edge. No single species caused this event. No external body struck the Earth. It was Earth itself, its own inner machinery, that created the crisis. A reminder that the planet's stability, while long-lasting, is not guaranteed. For Earth, it was the worst day, but not the last one. Because life, though damaged, did not vanish completely. A few lineages endured. They adapted to heat, to scarcity, to new climates. And in the strange, unsettled world that followed, they began to evolve again, differently this time, shaped by what had been lost. The Triassic period that came after would look nothing like the Permian. It would be drier, hotter, and more experimental. With fewer competitors, some survivors began to stretch out, change shape, and claim new ground. And soon, one group of reptiles would begin to grow larger, faster, and more elaborate. They would rise on two legs, stretch their necks, unfold feathers, grow horns, and fill every corner of the land. But they would not come quietly. When the Permian extinction ended, the planet was quiet, not peaceful, just empty. Ecosystems that had once thrived in complex balance were gone. Forests had thinned. Oceans had collapsed into low oxygen stasis. Most species had vanished, but a few things held on, and those that survived weren't the largest or the strongest. They were the ones that could deal with heat, drought, scarcity, generalists, borrowers, opportunists. Evolution doesn't preserve power, it preserves what works under pressure. And in the early Triassic, what worked was resilience. Among the survivors were a few groups of reptiles, lineages that had already existed during the Permian, small and largely unremarkable. Some were early diapsids, reptiles with two openings behind each eye socket, giving them lighter skulls and better muscle attachments for chewing and head movement. They weren't dominant, not yet, but they had options. The world they inherited was drier, hotter, and less stable than before. The supercontinent Panga still held most of the landmass together. That meant wide interiors with extreme temperatures, long seasons, and less coastal moderation. Rainfall patterns were disrupted. Ecosystems were fragmented. Vegetation was slow to recover. But what Panga lacked in stability, it offered in space. Reptiles with their scaly skin and shelled eggs had a built-in advantage. Unlike amphibians, they didn't need water to reproduce. Their eggs could survive on land. Their bodies resisted desiccation. That alone opened doors to new habitats. Dry plains, uplands, arid valleys where amphibians couldn't follow. Some reptiles began to grow larger, others grew faster. They took different paths, filled niches left vacant by the extinction. And over time they diversified into two major branches. The leptosaurs, which would eventually lead to lizards and snakes, and the Arosaurs, a group that would change the world. Arosaurs split again. One line led toward crocodiles and their relatives. The other would become the dinosaurs, but at first the differences weren't obvious. Early Arosaurs were lightly built, long-limbed and mostly carnivorous. They moved on four legs, but some were experimenting with bipedalism. Their skeletons hinted at speed. Their hips and ankles were built for flexibility. They weren't yet giants, but they were efficient. In the early Triassic, while ecosystems were still rebuilding, these Arosaurs became more prominent. They hunted smaller reptiles, insects, amphibians. They filled the role of mid-sized predators and scavengers. They weren't alone. Some synapsid survivors still held on, and other reptile groups were also diversifying, but the Arosaurs kept adapting. Their body plans were modular, their strategies diverse. As the Triassic progressed, reptiles began to take over not just the land, but the skies and seas as well. Some evolved into gliders, leaping from trees and coasting on skin flaps. Others entered shallow coastal waters and developed flippers, streamlined bodies, and powerful tails. The marine reptiles, ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, and others, would go on to rule the oceans for millions of years. But it was on land where the shift in power was clearest. Early dinosaurs didn't appear until later in the Triassic, and they didn't explode onto the scene. They arrived as minor players, small, fast, two-legged reptiles among a landscape of larger, better-established competitors. But they had a few crucial advantages. Their legs were positioned directly beneath their bodies, which gave them better support and more efficient movement. Their lungs may have been more advanced, delivering oxygen more effectively. Their metabolism might have been faster, closer to warm-blooded than cold. These traits weren't revolutionary on their own, but together they offered flexibility, speed, endurance, agility. In a world still recovering from ecological collapse, that mattered. By the late Triassic, dinosaurs had begun to expand. Some stayed small, relying on speed and agility. Others grew larger, developing stronger jaws, heavier limbs, and more specialized diets. Herbivores and carnivores alike began to fill out the ecological web again, slowly and with competition. Not all of that competition was from other reptiles. Some of it came from the last remaining synapsids, creatures that before the Paran extinction had dominated terrestrial life. These were the ancestors of mammals, though they didn't look like us. They were squat, broad-headed, and often nocturnal. For a while they held on, but their world was shrinking. By the end of the Triassic, another extinction event cleared the board again, not as severe as the Permian disaster, but enough to shake up ecosystems. The causes may have included volcanic activity and climate shifts tied to the rifting of Panga. Whatever the trigger, many of the remaining large amphibians and mammal-like reptiles vanished. This cleared the path. Dinosaurs, once marginal, took over, and the reptiles, already dominant in numbers and variety, became sovereign in scale. They didn't begin as thunderous giants. The earliest dinosaurs weren't the towering behemoths carved into museum walls or the armored icons of documentaries. They were small, fast, light, barely taller than a modern dog, and for a while they weren't even in charge. The late Triassic world they emerged into was rough and fragmented. Ecosystems were still healing from extinction. The continents were still one mostly a single massive landmass, Panga, that brought searing inland heat, unpredictable monsoons, and long, punishing droughts. The plants were mostly conifers, cycad, ginkgos, no flowers, no grass, just open forests, bare ground and scrub. And scattered through this terrain were the first true dinosaurs. They likely evolved in what is now South America from a group of small Arosaurs, already efficient runners, already leaning toward bipedal movement. These early dinosaurs weren't particularly exotic. They didn't have horns or plates. They weren't yet the apex hunters or the armored giants, but they had something else. Efficiency, the hips, for one. The dinosaur and hip structure held the legs directly beneath the body, rather than spread to the sides like in lizards. That meant a more upright stance which allowed them to run longer and faster. It also conserved energy over distance, which gave them more range. This design, paired with strong hind limbs and balanced tails, turned their bodies into machines for covering ground. And then there was their breathing. Some paleontologists believe dinosaurs had a unidirectional airflow system in their lungs, air moving in one direction through loops of hollow sacs, more like birds than mammals. If true, this gave them more oxygen efficiency, more stamina, and a higher metabolic rate than other reptiles of the time. Not fully warm-blooded perhaps, but not cold-blooded either. Something in between. With these advantages, the small early dinosaurs began to spread. They weren't alone. Pseudosuchians, relatives of crocodiles, were still a major presence. They included terrestrial predators, armored herbivores, and sprawling semi-aquatic species. For a time, they held many of the top spots in the food web. But then, around 201 million years ago, the Triassic ended with another extinction pulse. The exact cause is still debated. Volcanic activity tied to the breakup of Pangaea, massive climate shifts, methane releases. Whatever the trigger, it reset the land again. The Pseudoians were hit hard. Many mammal-like reptiles vanished too, but the dinosaurs, small and widely distributed, endured. That was their opening. In the early Jurassic, with fewer competitors, they expanded across continents into new niches, up the food chain. They didn't just survive, they radiated. Some remained small and nimble bipedal omnivores with sharp claws and good eyesight. Others grew. Their bodies lengthened, their diets shifted. Their social structures began to change. Within a few million years, they had diversified into distinct lineages. Theropods stayed on two legs, became faster, leaner, sharper. They hunted with teeth and talons. They were the ancestors of all birds. Sauropodomorphs took the opposite path. They went bigger, much bigger. Their limbs thickened, their necks extended, their bodies ballooned into forms that would eventually become the long-necked giants of the Jurassic and Cretaceous, some of the largest animals to ever walk on land. And then there were the Ornithischians, the beaked, often armored, often social branch of the dinosaur family. They would eventually evolve into the stegosaurs, ankylosaurs, ceratopsians, and hydrosaurs. But in the dawn of their lineage, they were just beginning to test the possibilities. By the Middle Jurassic, the dinosaurs were no longer fringe players. They were shaping entire ecosystems. Some walked in herds, others hunted in packs. They adapted to open plains, forest margins, coastal areas. They varied in size, behavior, and diet. No single body plant dominated. They weren't just multiplying, they were inventing. And they didn't just walk, they interacted. Fossil sites from this time show trackways, parallel sets of prints from multiple individuals walking together. They show growth patterns in bones that suggest group care, or at least life in structured groups. They show injuries that healed, indicating long lives and possible social support. They weren't mammals. They didn't need to be. Their success came from other tools: stamina, agility, diversity, and the ability to fill nearly every role in their ecosystems. In the oceans, marine reptiles unrelated to dinosaurs were claiming their own domains. Ichthyosaurs with their streamlined dolphin shapes, plesiosaurs with long necks and paddle limbs. But on land, dinosaurs were rising, not just in dominance but in design. The ground beneath them cracked and shifted. Pangaea began to split, forming rift valleys and new coastlines. Climate patterns shifted again. Rainfall increased in some regions, creating lush zones for larger herbivores. Dry belts persisted elsewhere, favoring agile hunters and drought-hardy foragers. And through all of this, the dinosaurs kept marching forward. Their bones were light for their size. Their bodies were efficient. Their eggs were laid in nests. Their senses, vision, balance, smell were tuned to the world around them. They didn't need to be the fastest or strongest in absolute terms. They just needed to be adaptable. They were. And soon the world would belong to them. Not for a moment, not for a few million years, but for the next 130 million. For all the fame that Tyrannosaurus rex enjoys, its reign was relatively brief. It lived at the very end of the Cretaceous, just before the asteroid struck. An apex predator, yes, but a latecomer to a world already shaped by countless others. Before it ever set a claw into the dirt, a long line of rulers had come and gone. Some of them were just as fierce, some were faster, others were larger, and they ruled their world without a name. Long before T-Rex, the dominant predators of the Mesozoic were already in place. In the Jurassic, it was the allosaurs that claimed the top of the food web. Their name, Allosaurus, means different lizard, and in many ways they were a turning point. Not quite as robust as T-Rex, but agile, strong, and widespread. Allosaurus wasn't the only one of its kind either. It was part of a broader group, the allosaurids and their kin, large theropods with powerful jaws, sharp claws, and a skull built to deliver slashing bites rather than crushing ones. Their arms weren't useless. In fact, in contrast to later tyrannosaurs, they were relatively well developed, three-fingered, often tipped with long claws, capable of gripping, raking, and helping subdue prey. Fossils show evidence of injuries, ribs healed after fractures, skulls marked by deep gashes, suggesting violent lives and survival through serious trauma. They lived in a world of giants. The herbivores they hunted were no less formidable. Long-necked saurians like Apatosaurus, Diplodocus, and Chimaerosaurus roamed the same Jurassic floodplains. These animals could reach over 20 meters in length with massive tails and thick limbs. Taking one down would not have been easy, but predators didn't need to kill the healthy giants. They likely hunted the young, the injured, the isolated, and they may not have hunted alone. There's some evidence, still debated, that allosaurs moved in groups. Trackways have been found showing multiple individuals traveling together. Whether that implies coordinated hunting or simply shared territory isn't clear. But the possibility that large theropods cooperated, even occasionally, changes how we view them. These predators had more than brute strength. Their skulls were engineered for speed. Air sacs lightened the bones, muscles attached in ways that allowed quick strikes. Their teeth, blade-like and serrated, weren't for crushing bone, but for slicing through flesh, leaving deep wounds that could bleed an animal into submission. And they weren't the only ones. Elsewhere in the Jurassic, other carnivores were evolving. Ceratosaurus, with its distinctive horned snout and long, flexible body, filled a slightly different role, perhaps more solitary, perhaps more specialized in forested or riverbank environments. Tyrannosaurus, larger and heavier, was closer in build to the later megalosaurs, a group of massive meateors that hunted across Europe and Africa. The diversity of theropods during this time was wide, even within the same regions. Some were built for power, others for speed. Some relied on ambush, others on pursuit. Their coexistence suggests ecological partitioning, different strategies for different prey, different terrain, different behaviors. And while they hunted, the herbivores were evolving defenses. Stegosaurus, famous for its backplates and spiked tail, roamed the same habitats. Its tail, the thagomizer, wasn't just for display. Fossil damage on predator bone suggests it was used effectively. A swing from a stegosaur's tail could shatter bone. Armor, size, and group behavior helped keep the balance. Predators couldn't afford to be reckless. One mistake could cost them a limb or their life. As the Jurassic gave way to the Cretaceous, the cast of predators shifted. Allosaurs declined, replaced by newer, more specialized theropods. In South America, Giganotosaurus rose longer than T-Rex with a skull that could stretch over 5 feet. In Africa, Carcharodontosaurus hunted on floodplains that are now desert. In what is now Morocco, Spinosaurus grew longer than any known terrestrial predator, its crocodile-like snout and sail-backed spine hinting at a partly aquatic life. These weren't just regional rulers. They were responses to local conditions. The breakup of Pangaea had fractured the Earth into separate landmasses. Isolation encouraged divergence. Different lineages rose on different continents. Abelisaurus in South America, Majungasaurus in Madagascar, Maposaurus, Tarbosaurus, Acranthosaurus, each one filling the apex role in its part of the world, and each one long gone before T-Rex took its throne. These predators shaped the ecosystems they lived in. They influenced the movement of herds. They pressured herbivores into new defenses, horns, armor, speed, size. They forced adaptations in behavior and biology. Every predator was also an agent of change just by existing, but none of them ruled alone forever. Evolution doesn't pause. It doesn't stop once something becomes successful. Even apex predators are temporary. Climate shifts, sea levels rise and fall, new species emerge. Competitors arrive. Ecosystems reshuffle. One ruler gives way to the next. And eventually the conditions were right for something faster, more robust, more specialized in bone-crushing power. Something with smaller arms, a massive head, and teeth that didn't just cut but shattered. Tyrannosaurus Rex was coming, but it was only the final act. The world had already seen kings, and it had already buried them. For most of their reign, dinosaurs have been imagined as scaly, cold-blooded reptiles, tail-dragging, slow-moving, solitary beasts. But the ground beneath that old image has shifted because fossils don't just capture bones. Sometimes they preserve impressions of skin. Sometimes they leave behind nests, eggs, even patterns of behavior. And sometimes they reveal something unexpected. Feathers. Not every dinosaur had them, but enough did to change the story entirely. These weren't just the delicate flight feathers we associate with modern birds. The earliest ones were simpler. Filaments, fuzz, quills, sprouting from skin like a downy covering. And they weren't just for flight. In fact, flight likely came later. Feathers may have started as insulation. For animals with faster metabolisms, the ability to trap heat matters. And there's evidence that many theropods, the same group that includes T-Rex and Velociraptor, were already running hotter than just typical reptiles. Feathers helped maintain body temperature, particularly in smaller species and juveniles. They also could have offered camouflage or display, visual signals for attracting mates, warning rivals, or identifying individuals. In some fossils, pigments have even been preserved. We can tell that some feathered dinosaurs weren't dull or gray. They had patterns, they had color, iridescent stripes, even speckles. What began as insulation became communication, and eventually in some lineages it became flight. But before flight came parenting. Theropods didn't just lay eggs and leave. Several fossil sites show adults carefully arranged over nests, limbs tucked, heads lowered, clearly brooding. Their posture is nearly identical to that of modern birds. In some cases, the eggs have preserved embryonic skeletons frozen in development. The adults likely kept the eggs warm, protected them from predators, turned them gently to ensure even incubation. This is where the old idea of cold in different reptiles falls apart because these creatures were doing something else. They were investing time, energy, and risk into the next generation. That kind of care doesn't appear in every dinosaur group, but among theropods, it seems to have been common. Some species even appear to have returned to the same nesting sites year after year, forming colonies, brooding, display, feathers, each trait adding a piece to a puzzle. And that puzzle begins to look familiar. Birds didn't emerge from dinosaurs suddenly. There was no sharp dividing line. Instead, one lineage of small theropods, possibly starting with feathered gliders, later evolving powered flight, gave rise to something new. Not a reptile, not quite yet a modern bird, but something in between. Archopric is often the name that comes up. Discovered in the 19th century, it had both feathers and teeth, wings and claws, a wishbone, but also a long bony tail. It perched in trees but had jaws full of sharp teeth. It looked like a mosaic, and for good reason. It was a transitional form, not the first bird, not the last dinosaur, just one point along the gradient. Other fossils have since pushed that boundary further. Microaptor with flight feathers on all four limbs, and Chiores with asymmetric feathers and a lightweight skeleton. Confucius Saunus with a beak but still retaining primitive traits. Each fossil pushes flight and bird-like traits deeper into the past. And as it turns out, flight didn't evolve once. Some paleontologists believe that gliding and even powered flight may have developed independently in multiple dinosaur groups. Not every feathered dinosaur flew, but many were trying. Not all birds come from meteors either. Some theropods, like oviraptorosaurs, were omnivorous or herbivorous, yet still built nests, brooded, and had feathers. These weren't just curiosities. They were functional, successful animals in their own right. Many of them lived in flocks. Some migrated. Some even had complex social behaviors. And here's the part that changes the story completely. Because the age of the dinosaurs didn't fully end. Yes, the asteroid came. Yes, most dinosaur species died out. But not all. One lineage of small feathered theropods survived. They were light enough to escape starvation, fast enough to avoid predators, possibly capable of flight, or at least roosting in trees, and they carried with them the traits that had already made them successful: feathers, warm-bloodedness, strong vision, and care for their young. Those survivors are still with us. Every bird you've ever seen is a dinosaur. Every sparrow, hawk, pigeon, and penguin. Every chick hopping across snow. Every flamingo balanced in a marsh. Their lineage stretches back not to reptiles in general, but to the same bloodline as Velociraptor. Their wings are modified arms. Their beaks evolved from jaws. Their eggs are nearly unchanged in form. The nests in trees, the songs in the morning, the flight patterns overhead. All of that is part of a story that began long before mammals took over. It's not a metaphor to say birds are dinosaurs, it's a fact. And while the giant roaring kind may be gone, the world still belongs just a little to their descendants. The beast never left. It just took wing. They weren't waiting. They weren't preparing. They were just surviving. For over 150 million years, mammals lived beneath the feet of giants. Not as prey necessarily, but certainly in the margins, small, quiet, and mostly unnoticed. While dinosaurs thundered across the landscape, displaying feathers, bellowing across floodplains, staking claims over plains and forests, mammals carved out a different existence, one that was nocturnal, cautious, and utterly essential. Their story doesn't begin with the asteroid. It began long before that. The ancestors of mammals go back to the Permian, back when reptiles first diverged from a shared ancestor with the synapsids. Those early mammal-like reptiles didn't look much like any modern creature. Broad heads, sprawling gaits, some were massive, others small and sharp-toothed. They were the dominant life forms on land for a while until the great dying at the end of the Permian. After that, most vanished, but a few synapsids endured. From those survivors came the cynodonts. Cynodonts were small, active, and strange. Their jaws were evolving. Bones that once formed part of the jaw joint were shrinking, migrating inward, eventually becoming part of the inner ear. Their teeth were differentiated in sizes, canines, murs, not the uniform rows seen in most reptiles. They were developing fur, or something close to it. Warm-bloodedness, too. Not fully, not universally, but the signs were there. And when the dinosaurs took over, the coded didn't vanish. They just adapted again. They shrank, they scattered, they went underground. They became generalists and specialists. They fed on insects, plants, small lizards, eggs, whatever they could find. And over millions of years, they became mammals. The first true mammals appeared in the late Triassic. Small, shrew-like creatures with fur-covered bodies and advanced inner ears. They probably laid eggs. They almost certainly nursed their young. And they did all of this in ecosystem dominated by creatures 10,000 times their size. Fossils of these early mammals are rare. Bones that small rarely survive the fossil record, but the ones we found are telling. Some had strong hind limbs suggesting they could leap. Others had gliding membranes like flying squirrels. Some were burrowers, others climbers. They weren't all doing the same thing. They were experimenting. What they didn't do was compete directly with the dinosaurs. There was no point. The top of the food chain was taken. So was the middle. Mammals instead evolved in the cracks, in the underbrush, in trees, in soil. They became experts at finding what the giants ignored, at moving when the giants slept. And most of them did sleep while the dinosaurs were awake. Many mammals in the Mesozoic were nocturnal. That shift offered advantages. Cooler temperatures, fewer predators, reduced competition. It also left marks on their evolution. Their eyes adapted. So did their brains. The parts that process hearing and smell expanded. In darkness, sound and scent mattered more than vision. This shift may be why even modern mammals retain those sensory biases. Why smell and hearing remain powerful for so many species even long after the Age of Darkness ended. The night left its fingerprints. Mammals remained small for the most part. A few pushed the limits, dog-sized, badgerized, but they never rose to dominate. Not in numbers, not in size, not in ecological impact, not while the dinosaurs were watching. But they didn't stagnate. They evolved placentas. They developed live birth multiple times and in multiple ways. Some still laid eggs like the ancestors of monotremes, but most began carrying their young inside. That shifted the strategy of reproduction. Fewer eggs, more care, more investment per offspring. They grew better teeth, sharper claws, more precise jaws. Their brains expanded, their behaviors grew more complex. Some began showing signs of parental care, social living, even problem-solving. And they waited, though not by choice. They were shaped by constraint. Their evolution was boxed in by the giants around them. They couldn't grow too large, couldn't roam too far, but they adapted with incredible depth inside those limits. A diversity of form and function that didn't need scale to be successful. And when the end finally came for the dinosaurs, the mammals were still there underground, in trees, in nests, nursing their young, tensing at every sound in the darkness, watching stars the dinosaurs never noticed. The age of giants was collapsing and the world was about to get quiet again. But this time they wouldn't stay in the shadows. It began with a streak. Maybe it was visible in daylight, maybe not. Maybe the sky tore open in silence at first. But then came the light, then the heat, then the sound, deeper than thunder, more final than any storm. The Earth didn't just witness impact, it absorbed it. Around 66 million years ago, a rock the size of a city slammed into the planet at over 70,000 kilometers an hour. It struck the shallow sea near what's now the Yucatan Peninsula, carving a crater more than 150 kilometers wide and nearly 20 kilometers deep. The energy released was beyond comprehension, billions of times stronger than the bombs dropped in any war. An entire era ended in less than a day. The Cretaceous was already changing. Volcanic eruptions in what's now India. The Deccan traps had been flooding the skies with gas for thousands of years. Temperatures had begun to fluctuate. Sea levels were shifting. But life was still holding strong. Dinosaurs dominated every landmass. Birds shared the sky with flying reptiles. The seas were full of ammonites, marine reptiles, and fish of all kinds. Mammals remained small. Flowers were flourishing. And then the impact changed everything. The blast itself was only the beginning. Shock waves flattened forest for hundreds of kilometers. The air ignited. Material ejected from the crater shot beyond the atmosphere only to fall back, molten, glowing, setting fire to ecosystems on the far side of the world. Wildfires swept continents. The sky darkened for weeks, maybe months, maybe years. Sunlight barely reached the ground. Photosynthesis ground to a halt. Plants withered. Plankton died off in the oceans. Food chains collapsed from the bottom up. What survived faced starvation, cold, and chaos. The fossil record shows the severity. Non-avian dinosaurs disappear abruptly. So do the pterosaurs. So do marine reptiles like the mosasaurs and plesiosaurs. Ammonites, once abundant, are wiped out. On land, most large animals vanish. Forests in some regions stop growing. Sediment layers from this moment are filled with soot-shocked quartz and a thin layer of vidium, a rare element more common in asteroids than on Earth. It's found around the globe. In the sea, the disruption was just as brutal. With plankton gone, creatures that relied on them died too. Coral reefs withered, fish populations plummeted, deep-sea ecosystems were less affected, buffered by darkness and isolation. But even there the effects were felt. Not all death was instant. Some dinosaurs may have lingered for days or weeks, surviving on what they could find. Others may have vanished with the plants they depended on. Predators went next. Ecosystems unraveled one link at a time. But even in this collapse, life clung on. Crocodiles made it. So did some turtles. So did insects, frogs, and a few small lizards. In the oceans, some fish survived, and deep-dwelling creatures weathered the change better than those near the surface. And birds, true birds, descended from theropod dinosaurs, survived as well. Small, beaked, and adaptable. They would be the only dinosaurs left to carry the lineage forward. Mammals too held on. The same traits that kept them in the shadows now helped them survive catastrophe. They were small and needed less food. Many were nocturnal, already suited for a world without sunlight. Some could burrow, avoiding fire and cold. They could eat anything, plants, insects, carrion, and they reproduced fast, nursing their young through the leaner stretches of collapse. These were not powerful creatures, not bold, not dominant, but they were enough. And once the smoke cleared, once the dust settled and light began to return, they stepped out into a changed world. It didn't bounce back quickly. Recovery took millions of years. Forests regrew. Oceans slowly restabilized. Diversity returned in bursts. But the balance of power had shifted. The giants were gone. The air was open. The niches were empty. There was no roar on the wind. No heavy footsteps across the plains. For the first time in over 150 million years, no creature on Earth weighed a ton. There were no armored backs, no massive jaws, no gliding reptiles hunting fish from the sky. Just birds, rodents, insects, and time. And into that emptiness new rulers began to emerge. They didn't come all at once, but they were ready. In the stillness that followed the fire, life began again. Not from the top, but from the edges. With the great reptiles gone, the stage wasn't empty. It was cleared, and what came next didn't rush forward fully formed. It crept in quietly from the underbrush, from burrows, from nests made of fur and grass. The survivors were small, but their time had come. This wasn't the start of mammals. That chapter had begun deep in the Mesozoic, while dinosaurs still ruled. But it was the start of their rise. The Age of Mammals didn't arrive like a thunderclap. It came like a thaw. The early Paleocene world just after the extinction didn't look much like the one we know. There were no giraffes or tigers, no elephants or whales. Even primates hadn't appeared yet. Instead, it was a landscape of small generalized mammals, shrew-like insectivores, rodent-like foragers, and a few strange holdovers from earlier times. What united them wasn't form, but function, adaptability, high reproductive rates, and low requirements. They didn't have to be big yet. Size would come later. At first, the world was about filling gaps. The forests were recovering, the air was warming, and wherever plants returned, animals followed. Mammals began to specialize. Some took to the trees, others stayed close to the ground. Some ventured into rivers, others began stalking through the ferns and low shrubs as new predators. And then the weirdness began. Within a few million years, mammals had exploded into dozens of new forms. With the dominant reptiles gone, evolution had room to experiment. There were hoofed animals with long tails and dog-like snouts. Flightless, predatory birds the size of humans stalked South American plains. Giant herbivores evolved tusks, horns, knobby skulls, and barrel-like torsos. Whales started as four-legged land animals, wandering into rivers and then the sea, where they eventually shed their limbs and became the swimmers we know today. Some mammals went underground, others grew skin flaps and glided between trees. And in Australia, isolated and free from placental competitors, marsupials filled nearly every ecological role. The Eocene, starting around 56 million years ago, was a period of global warmth. Rainforests stretched to polar regions. Mammals responded with further growth, literally. The first true primates appeared, small tree-dwelling, big-eyed creatures adapted for life among the branches. Bats took to the air. Horses the size of foxes began trotting through dense leafy woods. Even early elephants were barely larger than pigs. Size came in phases. The Oligocene cooled the planet again, shrinking the forests and expanding open grasslands. Mammals adapted once more. Limbs lengthened, teeth changed. Speed became a survival trait. Hooves appeared. Eyes moved to the sides of heads. Grazers began to run. Predators learned to chase. Cats hadn't fully arrived, but their ancestors had. Nimble, sharp-eyed carnivores evolved longer limbs and retractable claws. Packs began to form. Hunting became more strategic. Brains grew. So did coordination. In the water, whales had become fully aquatic. Basilosaurus, a serpentine giant with tiny hind limbs, hunted fish and early squid. Closer to shore, seals and walrus-like mammals evolved flippers. The land was still theirs, but the sea was no longer off limits. Some of the strangest animals to ever live came from this time. There were massive rhino-like herbivores, taller than giraffes and longer than buses, browsing on trees with their elongated necks. There were carnivorous hoofed mammals, creatures that looked like something between a pig and a bear but sprinted after prey with crushing jaws. And there were intelligents, often called hell pigs, huge omnivores with enormous heads, short tempers, and no clear modern analogue. The Miocene later on saw even greater diversity. Grasses spread across continents, creating savas. Mammals responded with bulk. Elephants grew tusks and herded. Camels and antelopes spread across Asia and Africa. Bears and big cats took up apex positions, and hominids, upright social primates, began to appear in the forests and woodlands of Africa. But for all the focus on what we now recognize, much of the mammalian world was still utterly alien. Sloths the size of minivans roamed South America. Armadillo-like mammals the size of small cars rolled through dry regions. There were ape-like primates with diets based entirely on fruit. There were saber-tooths, not just tigers but marsupial equivalents. Separate lineages evolved to fill the same role. Marsupials in isolation mirrored placental mammals in astonishing ways. In Australia, they produced their own versions of wolves, moles, antas, even a lion. Evolution kept circling back to the same shapes, not by plan, but by practicality. Every time a gap opened in the ecosystem, mammals filled it, often with something familiar, sometimes with something strange. Through it all, brains kept growing, not just in size, but in complexity. Social behaviors emerged. Some animals lived in groups, hunted cooperatively, defended territories, cared for young and extended networks. Play appeared. So did communication. Not language, not yet, but something more than instinct, memory, choice, learning. And slowly one group of primates began walking more upright. Their arms shortened, their hands freed, their vision sharpened, their tools changed. But that story doesn't belong to this moment. Not yet. The age of mammals wasn't defined by one species. It was defined by versatility. After the dinosaurs, it was mammals that bent to fit the Earth's new contours. Forest, grassland, ocean, cave. It was mammals that pushed evolution's toolkit in every direction. Huge, tiny, armored, furred, aquatic, airborne, social, solitary. They weren't one thing. They were everything, and they still are. By the time the first humans arrived, most of the great evolutionary drama had already played out. The Earth had spun through fire and ice. It had cracked itself open, stitched continents together, and pulled them apart again. Life had come from water, crawled onto land, and taken to the skies. It had invented teeth, feathers, milk, nests, and language. It had collapsed 5 times, and each time it had begun again, slower, smaller, different. We're late to the scene. The genus Homo emerged around 2.8 million years ago. That's nothing in geological time, not even a blink. More like the sound your eye makes when it moves. Our species, Homo sapiens, is younger still. Around 300,000 years, and we didn't arrive to a blank canvas. We came into a world already teeming with other humans, Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo florensis, and others now gone. We coexisted, overlapped, borrowed, interbred. For a while the Earth held many kinds of us, and we weren't exceptional at first. We didn't have cities or writing or industry. We didn't know what stars were. We shaped stone, carried fire, and learned slowly, mostly from mistakes. What we had, more than anything, was time. And other creatures had taught us how to use it. Mammals had taught us about warmth and memory. Birds taught us about movement, feathers, and care. Reptiles taught us about patience. Fish about persistence. Even the bacteria, the first whispers of life, taught us something vital. That survival doesn't always look like strength. Sometimes it just looks like staying, adapting, remaining just long enough to try again. We're made from the debris of everything that came before. Mitochondria in our cells trace their origin to ancient bacteria fused billions of years ago. The bones in our hands are echoes of fins. The folds of our brains grew over structures we share with reptiles. Our eyes aren't perfect. They're compromises built from parts repurposed over eons. We didn't start from scratch. Nothing does. Every evolutionary shortcut, every workaround, every leftover detail is still with us. Even our instincts, fear of the dark, the startle at sudden movement, the comfort of firelight are shaped by ancestors who lived without walls. The shape of our ears, the curve of our spine, the way babies grip with their fingers. Even when there's nothing to hold on to, it's all inherited. We're walking museums. We forget that sometimes. We imagine ourselves at the center of the story. But we are not the climax of evolution. We are a continuation, a current in a river that started long before there were names, borders, or even eyes to see. The story of life on Earth isn't about us. It includes us. That's different. And the echoes are still here. In every bird you hear at dawn, in every lizard sunning itself on a stone, in the mosses that creep along the base of trees, the insects that hum at night. The microbial life that fills your gut keeps you alive and outnumbers your own cells. Nothing is separate. We are late rivals to an ancient party, but we carry the memory of it in every cell, every heartbeat, every breath. You don't have to remember the trilobites. Your body already does, and the world remembers too. In the shape of valleys carved by ancient seas, in rocks formed from coral reefs long vanished, in coal beds pressed from the forests that once fed dragonflies the size of eagles, in the sky where birds still trace the outlines of long-dead reptiles, in the wind where spores and seeds still drift, carrying instructions written in a language older than ink. The earth is old, life is older, and before we were us, there were billions of others, some tiny, some vast, some strange beyond imagining, who lived, changed, ended, and passed something on. We're what they left behind, not the end of their story, just its next chapter. If you're still here, thank you. This wasn't about answers. It was about looking at the ground beneath us, the creatures who walked it first, the ones who never had names, and the echo still stitched into the world around us. We didn't start this story. We won't end it either, but we are in it. And maybe that's enough. See you next time.